The sky overhead was the color of iodine. Crystal mushrooms glowed beneath his feet. Around the corner stood a dog with 2 heads and 4 eyes that never blinked. And in the midst of this hell, a man pulled out a paper notebook and jotted down a note. The soil is sandy, high humidity, waterproofing needed. Because he is neither a warrior nor a hunter, he was given the role of a builder. Let's rewind an hour. Dan Song opens his eyes and feels the cold concrete against his cheek. His body is frozen. The lamp on the ceiling shines white light straight into his pupils. He sits up, leans his back against the wall. The room is 3 by 3 meters, smooth gray walls, no windows, no doors. Just a hatch in the ceiling and that damn light. And he remembers exactly how he died. The slab collapsed in the tunnel. A crunch. Darkness. And his last thought wasn't about life or fear. I wrote in the report that this slab needed reinforcing. And now he's here, alive, in a concrete box. A calm female voice sounds right inside his head. Shelter initialized. Capacity, 1 person. Coins, 0. To expand, survivors must be brought in. Dan doesn't flinch, doesn't scream. He sits for 20 minutes, staring at the wall. He pulls out his phone. Dead screen. No signal. He laughs, dry and short. 3 by 3 meters. No ventilation, no drainage, no emergency exit. It's not even a bunker. It's a coffin with a light bulb. He stands up, walks around the room, taps the walls with his knuckles. The sound is solid. Right. Reinforced concrete. Good concrete. Whoever poured these walls knew what they were doing. And right then, Dan freezes. Someone gave him a perfectly poured box. That means he can finish building the rest. His whole life, he'd been missing a client who didn't get in the way. It seems he's finally found one. The hatch gives way on the 3rd try. Heavy. Metal. Dan pulls himself up and climbs out. And that's when the strangest thing begins. The sky is the color of iodine. Ruins in every direction. Concrete skeletons of buildings. Reinforcing bars stick out of the walls like broken ribs. Crystalline mushrooms glow greenish even in broad daylight. Dan touches one. It's warm, pulsing, alive. 20 meters away stands a dog, but not a dog. 2 heads on 1 body. 4 eyes stare at him without blinking. The creature stands there for 10 seconds. Then it turns and walks around the corner. It doesn't attack. It doesn't growl. It just walks away. Dan exhales. He pulls out a paper notebook, a habit his colleagues considered strange. And in the midst of this dead world, he writes a technical specification. The soil is sandy, high humidity. Waterproofing is needed. The main structure must be laid deeper than 12 meters. The first resident can be anyone who's alive. Let's go. Because Dan Song is an engineer, and an engineer doesn't scream. An engineer calculates. He goes back down and thinks. The voice mentioned coins. For the survivors, not for the creatures, not for resources, for the living people he'll bring here. Whoever designed this system wanted him to go outside, to look for people, to build for them. Not a warrior, not a hunter, a builder. The very role he played his entire past life. Only now the stakes are a little higher than a parking garage for a business center. He climbs up again. The ruins turn out to be a city, or what's left of it. Rusty car wrecks have grown into the ground. How many years have passed? 10, 20, 40? Dan doesn't know. He holds on to the walls. He counts his steps. a habit from work. 2 blocks away, the first sign of people. A campfire under a tin roof. The ashes are still warm. Someone was here a few hours ago. Gnawed bones nearby. Animals. He'd like to believe that. 312 steps from the manhole, he hears a sound. A moan. A human moan. From under the rubble on the right. A concrete slab lies at an angle against the wall. A woman lies in the gap. Young. Her leg is pinned between 2 pieces of concrete. A fracture. Her eyes are open. She's looking at him. She isn't asking for help. She's just looking, as if she had long since stopped waiting for anyone to come. Dan crouches down. He examines the rubble. The slab is resting on 3 points. Remove the left support and the slab will shift, or crush her. He needs a lever. A rebar rod 3 meters away. A piece of concrete to use as a support. Dan assembles the contraption in 5 minutes. He asks the woman not to move. 1 pull of the lever. The slab shifts 8 centimeters. That's enough. He pulls her out by the arms. She screams when her foot slips. An open fracture of the shin, very bad. Without treatment, infection within a day. Dan rips off his jacket, tears the lining into strips, applies a splint made from a rod. Crooked, rough. But it holds. He lifts her up. She's too light. He carries her in his arms for 312 steps back. She clings to his shirt and won't let go. Climbing down into the manhole with a person in his arms is a task bordering on madness. Dan manages it. He sets her down on the floor. Now there are 2 of them. The woman looks around. There's nothing to breathe here. No water, no toilet. And she says only one thing. There's a roof here. And the voice in his head sounds again. Resident added. Lena Pack. Status, injured. 10 coins awarded. Expansion available. Dan feels it. A warm wave in his chest. The concrete box around them seems to sigh. He closes his eyes and senses the map. His box. And empty space nearby. Soil that can be turned into a room. 10 coins. 1 2x2 room. He pulls out a notebook and redesigns everything in 40 minutes. A ventilation shaft through the old sewer. A bunk bed made of rebar. A composting toilet made of a bucket and the ashes of which there are tons on the surface. Lena watches him sketch. This strange man isn't panicking. He isn't rushing about. He draws lines with a look on his face as if he's solving an interesting problem rather than fighting for his life. Dan activates the system. He directs the expansion not to the right, where a second living, but down and to the side. A rumble. A vibration. The concrete behind the wall trembles and expands. In 3 minutes, a second room appears. Dan immediately climbs up. He drags a pipe fragment down. He inserts it into the wall at an upward angle. An hour later, air is flowing. Fresh. With a hint of mineral dust, but fresh. Lena says he's strange. Everyone builds a place to sleep first. Dan shrugs. You can sleep on the floor for a week, but you need to breathe right away. And Lena smiles for the first time. By evening, he sets up a portable toilet. Lena's leg is bad. She needs antiseptic. We need water. All tomorrow. Today they're alive. There's a roof. There's air. There's light. In a world where the most valuable currency is 8 hours of sleep under a roof where you won't get eaten, they now have exactly that. Dan sits by the wall. Lena lies on his jacket. Something howls behind the hatch. A creature, or the wind, or both. Dan opens his notebook and writes. Day 1. 2 residents, 2 rooms. The ventilation is working. We need water. We need food. We need people. We need everything. Let's go. Dan woke up from the cold. The concrete floor shows no mercy to those who sleep without a mattress. His back is stiff. His neck hurts. Lena had slept curled up in a ball on his jacket. Her leg had swollen overnight. Even in the dim light of the lamp, it was clear that the swelling had crept above her knee. Bad. They might have a day before the infection sets in. Dan stood up. He stretched his shoulders. He checked the ventilation. Air is flowing. The draft was weak but steady. Good. He climbed up through the hatch. Morning on the surface looked almost the same as evening. The iodine-colored sky had grown slightly lighter. The crystalline mushrooms on the asphalt pulsed more slowly. Apparently they have a cycle. Dan jotted this down in his notebook. Every detail might come in handy. First task for today: water. A person can survive 3 days without water. They don't have a single drop. Dan walked east along the street. He chose that direction because he'd noticed it yesterday. The ground sloped in that direction. A slope means runoff. Runoff means water. 20 minutes later, he found what he was looking for. An old fountain in the square in front of a ruined building. The basin was cracked, but not all the way through. Rainwater had collected at the bottom. It was murky, with a greenish tint. It wasn't drinkable, but if he boiled it and filtered it through sand and charcoal, he could give it a try. Dan filled 2 plastic bottles he'd found in the rubble nearby with water. Then he inspected the building. A former office or bank, 3 stories. The top floor had collapsed completely. The middle floor was half gone. The bottom floor was almost intact. Inside, he found a few useful things. A first aid kit. Old. Expired by about 30 years. But bandages are bandages. The antiseptic in its sealed package might still work. Plastic cups, spoons, a piece of rope, a backpack with a torn strap. Dan took everything. In a world without manufacturing, every item has value. On the way back, he noticed movement. To the right, around the corner of the ruined store. Dan froze. He held his breath for 5 seconds. Then he peeked out cautiously. 2 people, a man and a girl of about 10. The man was thin, tall, with a homemade spear made from a pipe and a knife tied to it. The girl was hiding behind his back. They stood there, looking at Dan. The man held the spear at the ready, not aggressively, defensively, protecting the child. Dan raised his hands, palms forward, slowly, showed that he was holding only water bottles and a backpack. The man didn't lower his spear, but he didn't strike either. They stood like that for half a minute. Then Dan said he had shelter, underground, with a roof and fresh air. If they wanted a dry night, they could go with him. The man looked at him for a long time. Then he asked what the price was. Dan said there was no price. The man didn't believe him. In this world, everything has a price, especially a roof. Dan shrugged and said he was an engineer, not a merchant. He needed people, not payments. The man thought for another minute. The girl tugged at his sleeve and whispered something. The man nodded. He said his name was Jin, and that this was his daughter, Sua. They'd been walking without shelter for 4 days now. 2 nights ago, a pack of mutated rats had attacked them, and he'd killed 7 of them, but one had bitten Sua on the arm. The wound had become infected. Dan looked at the girl's hand. Red, swollen. 2 days without treatment. There's antiseptic in the first aid kit from the office. Maybe there's enough for 2. For Sua and for Lena. He led them to the hatch. Jin walked in silence. Sua held her father's hand and looked back at every sound. Dan counted his steps, memorizing the route, plotting every landmark on the map in his head. When they went downstairs and Jin saw a 3x3 concrete room with a light and a second room with ventilation, he stopped. He stood there for a moment. Then he said that in 4 days of travel, this was the first place that didn't reek of death. Lena woke up from the noise. She saw the child. Something changed in her face. Dan noticed but didn't ask. He got to work. The antiseptic from the first aid kit turned out to be effective. The airtight packaging had preserved it. Dan treated Sue's wound, then Lena's. The bandages were old and yellow, but clean. He applied a new bandage to Lena's leg. The splint is holding. The fracture hasn't shifted. We're lucky. A voice in his head sounded twice. Resident added, Jin Pak, 10 coins credited. Resident added, Sua Pak, 10 coins credited. 20 coins, plus the 10 left over from the first expansion. Total, 30. Dan sat down in the corner and closed his eyes. A map of the shelter unfolded before his mind's eye. 2 rooms, 4 people, 30 coins. 1 room costs 10 coins. That means 3 rooms. But which ones? Dan opened his notebook and began to calculate. They need a storage room, a place to store water, food, and items found during. They needed another living room because 4 people in a 3x3 space was impossible. They needed a workshop, a place to repair tools and make simple things. 3 rooms, 3 different purposes. But Dan knew something the others didn't. Modularity. Each room should be a node in the system, not just a box. The storage room should adjoin the living area to minimize movement. The workshop should have separate ventilation because dust and smoke from work can't be allowed into the living quarters. He sketched for 2 hours. Jean sat nearby and watched silently. Then he asked what it was. Dan explained. This is the expansion plan. The storage room will go here. Here is the living room for Jin and Sua. Here is the workshop. The ventilation will go this way, the drainage this way. The passage between the rooms is through the central corridor. Jean listened. Then he said that before the rift, he had been a carpenter. Dan looked up and stared at him. A carpenter? A man who works with wood and knows how to join materials. There's no wood in a concrete basement. But he has the skill. He has the hands. He has an understanding of construction. Dan said he needed help. He could design, but he wouldn't have time to physically build everything on his own. Jean nodded. He didn't smile. He hadn't smiled even once since the moment they met. But he nodded, and that was enough. By evening, Dan had activated the system 3 times. 3 new rooms unfolded in the ground, one after another. A rumble, a vibration. The concrete grows as if alive. Walls take shape in minutes. A 2x3 storage room, a 3x3 living room, a 2x2 workshop, and a corridor between them. Narrow, 1.20 meters wide, but it's a corridor. The shelter's first corridor. Dan stood in it and looked both ways. To the left, the living area. To the right, the utility rooms. 5 rooms, 4 people. The air circulates. The system is working. He ran his hand along the corridor wall. Smooth concrete. Cool. Solid. Somewhere inside him, a strange feeling stirred. Pride. No, not pride. Recognition. He'd been doing this his whole life, designing spaces for people. Only before, they were parking lots and subway tunnels. And now it was a home. A real home for people who had nowhere else to live. The next morning, Dan went up to the surface for water. He retraced yesterday's route to the fountain. He filled 4 bottles. On the way back, he stopped by the ruined supermarket. The shelves were empty, looted decades ago. But in the back room, behind a broken door, he found a crate of canned goods. The cans were swollen, dangerous, but 3 of them looked fine. Dan took them. He also found a coil of wire, a roll of plastic sheeting, 2 flashlights without batteries, a lighter that still worked. Every item is a brick in the wall of survival. When he returned, Lena was sitting against the wall, talking to Sua. The girl was listening with her eyes wide open. Lena was telling her something. Dan didn't listen in. He noticed something else. Lena was looking at Sua as if she were seeing someone else, someone she had lost. Meanwhile, Jin was inspecting the workshop. He had already found a use for the rebar. He bent one into a hook for hanging a backpack. He made a shelf support out of another. A carpenter is a carpenter. Even without wood, his hands remember. Dan laid out the supplies in the pantry. 3 cans of food, 4 bottles of water, the remains of a first aid kit, a coil of wire, plastic sheeting, flashlights, a lighter, a notebook, a pencil. All the possessions of a small community of 4 people. He wrote a complete list in the notebook, with the dates they were found and the condition of each item. Documentation. In a world where knowledge dies with its bearer, Dan has been writing everything down since day 1. That evening, they opened 1 can of food. Beans. Cold, tasteless, wonderful. Sua ate greedily. Jin made sure his daughter ate more. Lena gave half of her portion to the girl. Dan noticed and gave part of his to Lena. Lena started to argue. Dan said he needed fewer calories because he'd mostly been sitting and drawing today. That wasn't true. He'd been hauling water and climbing through the ruins for half the day. But Lena accepted it and fell silent. After dinner, Dan sat in the workshop and thought. They have 5 rooms. There's ventilation. There's a 2-day supply of water. Food for 1 day. We need a water source. A permanent one, not a rainwater fountain. Something reliable. Sewers on the surface. The old city sewer system. If the pipes aren't completely destroyed, there might be an underground aquifer somewhere. Dan sketched a map of the city from memory. He'd only walked a few blocks, but could already reconstruct the general layout. The streets ran in a grid, so the city was planned. So the engineering infrastructure was also grid-based. Water mains, sewers, electricity, all underground. It might all still be intact, if he's lucky. Tomorrow he'll go look. Deeper, further. He lay down on the workshop floor. Hard, cold. Fine. Through the wall, he could hear Sua muttering something in her sleep. Jean wasn't sleeping. He was keeping watch, out of habit. 4 days without a roof turns a man into a sentry. Dan closed his eyes. The system was silent. 0 coins. New coins require new people. And to find new people, you have to go out and look for them. And every time you go out is a risk. 2-headed dogs, mutated creatures, salt storms he's only heard about from Jean so far, poisonous air in certain zones, and other people, not all of whom are friendly. Jean told him over dinner. There are gangs. There are loners. There are groups that kill for a pair of boots. The world up there isn't just dead. It's dangerous. Actively dangerous. And Dan has to go out into it, again and again. Because the system only gives coins for those he's saved personally. Not Jean. Not Lena. Him. Personally. Every time. The rule seemed cruel. An administrator who wants to rise is forced to remain a rescuer. An architect who must design is forced to risk his life on the surface. But Dan understood the logic. Whoever designed the system didn't want him to become a king in an underground palace. That person wanted Dan to look people in the eye. Everyone. Personally. And decide whether that person was worthy of a room in his house. Dan closed his eyes. Behind the wall, Sua had stopped muttering. Jean finally sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall. Lena was breathing evenly. 4 people underground. Above them, a dead city. Above the city, a sky the color of iodine. Somewhere out there, The crack, which was getting wider every day. And they had maybe 5 years, maybe 7, maybe less. Dan rolled onto his side and stared at the wall. Concrete, reliable, strong. His concrete, his walls, his people. Let's go. On the 4th day, Dan went farther than before. He left Jin in charge. Lena couldn't walk. Sua was a child. Jin was the only one who could stand by the manhole with a spear if something went wrong. Dan took a backpack, a bottle of water, a notebook, a rebar rod just in case. Not a weapon, just a stick. He headed south, in the direction where, according to his calculations, the city's main sewer line was supposed to run. If he was right, there was a manhole somewhere out there. Or a collector, or at least a pipe through which groundwater flowed. The ruins in the south were worse. The buildings had collapsed more severely. The ground had subsided. Entire neighborhoods had turned into hills of broken concrete and rusty metal. Crystalline mushrooms grew more densely here. Some were as tall as a man. Dan walked around them. No one knew what they did upon contact. After walking for 40 minutes, he found a manhole. A sewer manhole. Cast iron, overgrown with mushrooms but intact. Dan cleared the cover with a rebar rod. He pried it open. A smell from below hit his nose. Not sewer, no. Dampness and minerals and something else. Something alive. Dan climbed down the rusty brackets. The flashlight wasn't working. No batteries. But crystalline mushrooms were growing here, too. On the pipe walls, on the ceiling. They gave off enough light to see 3 meters ahead, a greenish, flickering light. Beautiful, if you forget where you are. The collector turned out to be intact. An old concrete pipe with a diameter of 1.5 meters. You could walk through it by crouching. Dan walked and counted his steps. Moisture on the walls. Condensation. A good sign. Where there's condensation, there's a temperature difference. Where there's a temperature difference, there's water movement. After 200 steps, he found it. A crack in the collector wall. Water was seeping through the crack. A thin stream. Clean. Clear. Dan held out his finger. Cold. Odorless. An underground aquifer. He filled a bottle in 10 minutes. It wasn't much, but it was a constant source. If he widened the crack or ran a pipe to it, he could get 20 liters a day, more than enough for 4 people. Dan jotted down the coordinates. Distance from the manhole, direction, depth, crack diameter, estimated water flow. All in his notebook. On the way back from the collector, he heard sounds. Up above, on the surface. Screams. Not human. A shriek. A screech. Then a human scream. Short. Cut off. Dan froze. He stood in the pipe and listened. Silence for a minute. Then footsteps. Lots of footsteps. Small and quick. A pack. Something ran past him on the surface and headed west. Dan waited another 5 minutes. Then he made his way up. A man lay in the square in front of the ruined building. A middle-aged man. Dead. Torn apart. Dan didn't look at the details. A bag lay next to the body. Dan picked it up. Inside were things that were useless to the dead, but priceless to the living. A knife. A real hunting knife in a leather sheath. A coil of rope. A flint. A can of something, some kind of loose powder. Dan opened it and sniffed. Salt. Ordinary salt. In the world after the rift, salt is medicine, a preservative, and currency. He closed the jar and put it in his backpack. Then he stood over the body. He didn't know this man, but this man was carrying supplies. That meant he was going somewhere. That meant he had a purpose. Not anymore. Dan couldn't do anything for the dead man, but he could do something for the living. He returned to the hatch of his shelter. He climbed down. He laid out his finds. He told Jean about the aquifer. For the first time in 4 days, something resembling relief flashed in Jean's eyes. Water meant life, not temporary, permanent. Dan spent the rest of the day designing a water supply system. They needed a pipe from the main line to the shelter. The distance is about 400 meters. They could route it through the old sewer system, but they don't have 400 meters of pipe. The system can build rooms, but not pipes in the ground. So they'd have to look for pipes on the surface, or build intermediate hub rooms along the route. Each room costs 10 coins. He has 0. He needs people. For the next 3 days, Dan went to the surface every morning. He expanded the survey area, 1 kilometer further each day. The map in his notebook grew. He marked everything down, destroyed buildings with a note on the degree of destruction. Clusters of crystalline mushrooms, creature habitats, sources of useful materials, hazard zones. On the 6th day, he found people, 3 of them, a man, a woman, and a teenager of about 15. They were sitting in the basement of a ruined apartment building. No heat, no water, no hope. The man was injured. His right arm hung limply, dislocated or broken. The woman was coughing, deep and wet. The teenager stared at Dan with empty eyes. Dan crouched down in front of them. He said he had a shelter, underground, with air and water. The man asked the same question as Jean. What's the price? Dan answered the same way. There is no price. The man didn't believe him. The woman coughed. The teenager stood up and said he'd go. He didn't care where, as long as it wasn't here. The man looked at him, then at Dan. Then he stood up and nodded. The walk to the shelter took an hour. The man walked slowly because of his arm. The woman walked even slower. Dan led them along a safe route, the one already marked in his notebook, past the ruins where he hadn't seen any creatures, through streets with good visibility, across intersections where they could quickly retreat into an alley. When they went down into the shelter, the teenager stopped in the hallway. He stood there and just breathed. Then he said, "It smelled like concrete here. Clean concrete. Not rot, not blood. Concrete." He said he'd forgotten what concrete smelled like. A voice in Dan's head sounded 3 times. Jonas Berg, 37 years old, 10 coins. Sarah Berg, 34 years old, 10 coins. Oscar Berg, 15 years old, 10 coins. 30 coins. Dan closed his eyes. 30 coins, 3 rooms. Or 1 larger one and 2 small ones, or 2 medium-sized ones and a utility room. He began to count. 7 residents, 5 rooms. Not enough. He'd need at least 8 rooms by the end of the week. Living quarters for the newcomers, an expansion of the storage room, and, most importantly, the plumbing hub. An intermediate room halfway to the sewer through which he could run a pipe. Dan spent 30 coins in a single evening. 2 living rooms for the Berg family and the plumbing hub. A small 2x2 in the ground between the shelter and the collector. He'll run a pipe through it. Well, not exactly a pipe. A channel. An open trough lined with scraps of plastic pipes found on the surface. Primitive. Inefficient. But it works. 2 days later, they had water. Real, running water from the aquifer. Clean, cold, safe. Lena drank and couldn't stop. Sua splashed water on her face and laughed. The first child's laughter in the shelter. Dan stood in the hallway, listening to that laughter and writing in his notebook. The water supply was now operational. The flow rate was about 15 liters per day, enough for 7 people. As the population grows, the water intake will need to be expanded. Jonas Berg turned out to be a former electrician. Before the rift, he worked at the substation. His right arm was dislocated, not broken. Lena set it with Jin's help. Jonas screamed, but endured it. 3 days later, his arm was working. And the first thing he did with that arm was to assemble a simple electrical circuit from some wires he'd found and a car battery that Dan had brought up from the surface. The lamp in the workshop now burned off the battery, not the grid. The light was dim, yellow, ugly. Dan looked at it and thought it was the most beautiful light he had ever seen in this world, because they had made this light themselves. Not the system. People. The end of the first week. 8 rooms, 7 residents, water, electricity from a single battery, a pantry with a dozen cans of food and a bag of salt, a workshop where Jean makes furniture out of rebar and found planks, a medical station where Lena treats people with whatever she has. Dan sat in his old 3x3 room, the first room. It had now become his office, or headquarters, or a sanctuary. He had hung blueprints on the walls, a plan of the shelter, a ventilation diagram, a map of the surface, a list of residents, a list of resources, a list of tasks. The notebook was running out. Need paper. One more thing on the endless list of what's needed. He wrote the last line on the last page. Day 7. 8 rooms, 7 residents. Water available, light available, food for 3 days. Need a farm. Need more people. We need everything, but the foundation is in place, and it's solid. On the 9th day, Dan faced for the first time something you can't run from. A salt storm. He was on the surface, 3 kilometers from the shelter, his farthest foray yet. He was exploring the industrial zone to the east, former warehouses, former factories, a place where one could find tools and materials. He found a lot. A box of wrenches, a roll of copper wire, 3 bags of cement in airtight packaging. Cement. In a world where the system builds concrete walls, cement seemed pointless. But Dan knew. The system builds rooms. But between the rooms and the surface, there are gaps, cracks, joints that the system doesn't seal. Cement is needed for sealing, for repairs, for everything the system doesn't do. He packed his backpack to the brim, heavy, 30 kilograms. His back won't thank him. But every kilogram is a step toward a normal life. He was walking back when he saw the horizon, a yellow wall, from the ground to the sky, moving fast. Dan stopped and watched for 5 seconds. Then he ran. Jean had told him about the salt storms. The wind carries crystalline dust, salt and something else, something from the rift. The dust eats away at your skin in half an hour, your eyes in 10 minutes, your lungs in 5. The only way to survive: shelter, walls, a roof, airtight. 2.5 kilometers to the shelter hatch. The wall was getting closer. Dan dropped his backpack. No, he didn't drop it. He took off the cement bags and left them behind. He grabbed the keys and the wire, 20 kilos lighter. He ran. His heart was pounding, his feet on uneven ground, across broken concrete, through thickets of crystalline mushrooms, past the wrecks of cars. He didn't count his steps. For the first time ever, he didn't count. He counted only the seconds. The wall behind him, closer. He could smell it. Bitter, mineral, pungent. The skin on the back of his neck began to tingle. The first dust particles. 1 kilometer to the hatch, maybe less. The wall was catching up. Dan saw familiar ruins, a building with a broken roof, a landmark on his map. 300 meters to the hatch. He turned onto the street, straight, long, the manhole at the end, 200 meters. Dust was already in the air. His eyes were watering. His skin was burning. He shut his eyes tight. He ran the last 50 meters blind, by memory, by the count of steps he'd drilled into his muscles over 9 days. His hand found the edge of the manhole. He dove down, slammed the lid shut, leaned his full weight on it. A roar came from outside. Dust pounded against the metal of the manhole like a sandblaster. Dan sat on the steps and breathed, heavily, hoarsely. His hands were shaking. The skin on the back of his neck and on his arms was red, scorched, but alive. He went downstairs. Lena saw him and turned pale. He looked terrible. Red spots on his skin, watery eyes, skinned knees from running through the ruins. Lena sat him down, rinsed his eyes with water, treated his skin with whatever she had, not much. Then she told him he was an idiot, that he shouldn't have gone so far alone, that if he died, it would all be over. Dan said nothing. She was right. He was the only one who received coins, the only one the system listened to. If he died, the shelter would remain, the walls would stand, water would flow. But there would be no expansion. There would be no new rooms, no new residents. Everything would freeze. Forever. He had no right to die. This was a new realization. Unpleasant. Oppressive. He wasn't just an engineer. He was the system's single point of failure. The only one. If he failed, the entire structure was doomed. And this contradicted everything he had been taught. A good project doesn't depend on a single person. A good project outlives its creator. His shelter cannot do that yet, so it needs to be changed. A salt storm raged above for 3 days, 3 days without access to the surface, 3 days on internal supplies. The food ran out on the 2nd day. Water from the underground spring flowed without interruption. Praise be to the design. But hunger is hunger. Suha cried quietly at night. Jin sat with her and held her hand. Oscar Berg, the teenager, was silent. He rarely spoke anyway. He stared at the walls. He stared at Dan. He was thinking about something of his own. Jonas was fixing the electrical system. Keeping his hands busy meant his mind wasn't on food. Sarah Berg was coughing less. The dry air of the shelter helped. Or maybe she'd just gotten used to it. Lena was bandaging everyone in turn. Dan, Sue, whose wound from a rat bite was finally healing, Jonas, whose arm still ached, his own leg. The splint was still in place. The fracture was healing slowly. No x-rays, no cast, no proper medicine, just time and hope. Dan made the most of those 3 days. Every hour, he was designing. He sat in his 3-by-3-foot room and sketched on the backs of can labels because he'd run out of notebook paper. He was designing a farm. Hydroponics. He knew the principle. Plants grow in water with a nutrient solution, without soil. Light is needed. Water is needed. You need seeds. You need a container. The light from the system lamps works. There's water. The container can be made from plastic found on the surface. Seeds. That's the problem. Where to get seeds in a world that's been burning for 40 years? Jean had an idea. There are nomadic groups that grow crops on the move. In sacks of soil they carry on their backs. They trade seeds. For salt, for tools, for dry nights. Dan has salt. Half a can. That might be enough for a couple of handfuls of seeds. If he can find the nomads, if they agree to trade, if they don't try to kill him and take everything. On the third day, the storm subsided. Dan waited another 2 hours, just to be sure. Then he opened the hatch. The surface had changed. The crystalline mushrooms had wilted. The ones that had been as tall as a man had now melted down to half their size. The storm was hitting them, too. A layer of whitish dust covered the asphalt. Dan didn't touch it. He put a cloth dampened with water over his face. He wrapped his arms. He went out. The air still smelled bitter, but was bearable. He headed southwest, toward where, according to Jean, one of the nomadic routes passed. After 4 hours of walking, he found no nomads. He found something else. She was sitting on the roof of a 1-story building. Her legs dangled down, a spear in her hands, 2 knives on her belt. Her hair was cut short, a scar across her left eyebrow. She looked down at Dan and didn't move. Dan stopped. He raised his head. They stared at each other for 5 seconds. Then she jumped off the roof. She landed softly, like a cat. She stood up to her full height, a head shorter than Dan, but 3 times more dangerous. You could tell by the way she stood, by the way she held the spear, by the way her eyes moved, scanning, assessing, deciding. She said he was alone. Not a question, a statement. Dan confirmed it. She said loners don't live long. Dan said he wasn't a loner. He had people, and a shelter. She smirked, said everyone claims to have a shelter. Usually it's a hole in the ground with a sheet of tin on top. Dan said he had concrete walls, ventilation, running water. She stopped smirking, looked at him, more intently. She asked who he was. Dan said he was an engineer. She was silent for a moment. Then she said her name was Hesso Cho, that she was the last of the Cho clan, 30 people, 29 dead. She was alone, for 6 months now, and that she didn't need a shelter. She needed a reason to live. Dan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't good with fancy words. He was good at drawing. So he took out his nearly empty notebook and showed her a sketch of the shelter. 8 rooms, a hallway, a ventilation system, plumbing, a list of residents. Hesso looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she said it was a real plan, not the ramblings of a madman. Dan said thank you, and that he needed someone who knew how to defend, because all he knew how to do was build. Hesso looked at him, then at the spear in her hand, then back at him. She said she'd go, but if it was a trap, she'd kill him first. Dan nodded. Fair enough. They walked back for 4 hours. Hesso walked 5 steps behind. She didn't trust him. She was keeping him under control. Dan didn't turn around, not because he trusted her, because if she wanted to stab him in the back, he wouldn't have time to react anyway. When they went down into the shelter, and Hesso saw the hallway and the rooms and the lamps, and heard the sound of running water from the plumbing, she stopped. She stood there for a minute. Then she turned to Dan and said she'd been wrong. This isn't a hideout. It's a home. The system's voice sounded. Resident added, Hesso Cho, 26 years old, 10 coins allocated. 10 coins. 1 room. Dan knew which one. He activated the system and built a room for Hesso next to the entrance corridor. A strategic position, between the outside world and the living area. Hesso understood without explanation. It wasn't just a room, it was a post. She nodded. For the first time all day, something other than wariness flashed in her eyes. In the evening, Hesso sat by the wall and cleaned her spear. Sua approached her and sat down silently beside her. Hesso glanced at the child. Then she continued cleaning. Sua didn't leave. 5 minutes later, Hesso began to quietly tell her something. Dan didn't hear what, but he saw how Hesso's shoulders dropped slightly, relaxed a little, as if someone had lifted a weight from them that she herself hadn't noticed. 8 residents, 9 rooms. The storm had passed. Water was flowing. They now had a warrior, a real one, a professional one. Dan lay in his room and thought. Tomorrow he had to find seeds. The day after tomorrow, start building the farm. In a week, bring in more people. In a month, they should have 12 residents. In 3 months, 30. He wrote this down on the back of the label. Numbers, deadlines, tasks, like a project. Because this is a project. The biggest of his life, the most important, the only one that matters. The farm began with a bucket of dirt. Dan stood in the new 4-by-3-foot room and looked at it. Empty, clean, with a light bulb on the ceiling and a vent in the wall. The perfect room for hydroponics. But hydroponics requires a nutrient solution, and nutrient solution requires chemicals they don't have. So no hydroponics. So they'll have to improvise. Dan grabbed the bucket, climbed to the surface, and scooped up some soil. The soil after the rift was strange, sandy with flecks of crystalline dust. It wasn't certain that anything would grow in it, but they had to try. They didn't have any seeds yet, but Hesso solved that problem faster than Dan expected. On the third day after arriving at the shelter, she went to the surface to scout. She returned 6 hours later with 3 things: a sack of grain, a bundle of dried roots, and information. She'd found a nomadic group 12 kilometers to the southwest. 8 people, caravanners. They were heading north toward the granite syndicate. Hesso didn't try to trade with them. She waited until 2 of the group fell behind to fetch water from a stream. She approached them. She offered a trade: salt for seeds. They agreed. Half a can of salt for a sack of grain, and roots that turned out to be something like wild carrots. Dan looked at the sack of grain and thought. Grain means bread. Bread means calories. Calories mean life. He poured some of the grain into a bucket of soil. He watered it. He placed it under a lamp, and he waited. Whether the grain grew or not, Dan kept himself busy with other things. By the 12th day, the shelter had 10 rooms and 8 residents. 0 coins. He needed people. Now he didn't go out alone. Hesso walked with him. More precisely, ahead of him. 10 paces ahead, spear at the ready. She moved differently. Not like a person exploring. Like a predator hunting. Every sound, every movement, every scent. She read the terrain as Dan read blueprints. They found 2 people, a brother and sister, young, in their early 20s, hiding in a ruined auto repair shop, without food for 5 days. The brother could barely stand. The sister was holding up better, but in her eyes was that very expression Dan had already learned to recognize. Emptiness. When a person stops believing that tomorrow will be better than today. Dan told them about the shelter. The brother didn't react. The sister asked how far it was. Dan said 2 kilometers. She nodded and helped her brother up. Hesso brought up the rear. She watched the rear. In the shelter's hallway, the sister stopped. She touched the wall, ran her fingers over the concrete. Then she looked at Dan and asked who had built all this. Dan said, the system. She asked who controlled the system. Dan said he did. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said her name was Mira, and she knew how to grow things. The system's voice. 2 new residents, Mira Evans and Tom Evans. 20 coins. Dan built 2 more rooms, 11 and 12. 10 residents. Mira came into the farm room the next morning. She saw a bucket of soil. She crouched down. She touched the soil. She sniffed it. She shook her head. Then she looked at Dan and said that the soil from the surface was toxic. Crystalline dust poisons the roots. But if you rinse the soil 3 times through a cloth and mix it with ash, you can neutralize it. Not completely, but enough for it to grow. Dan watched her. Then he jotted it down in his notebook, or rather, on a scrap of packaging. Mira Evans, a natural-born agronomist. Mira wasn't an agronomist. She grew up in a nomadic group where everyone carried a sack of soil on their back. She grew food on the move, at rest stops, in ruins, in basements, everywhere. She had a green thumb. She talked to plants, literally. Dan heard her whispering something to a bucket of soil on the 3rd night. He didn't comment. An engineer isn't superstitious, but an engineer acknowledges the result. And the result was this. A week later, the first sprouts emerged from the soil that had been washed and mixed with ash. Green. Alive. Real. Sua stood there staring at them, her mouth agape. She asked Mira what it was. Mira said it was food. Sua asked if she could touch it. Mira said yes. Sua touched the sprout with her fingertip, gently, as if she were touching something sacred. For a child who had grown up in a world of ash and ruins, a green sprout was indeed sacred. Tom Evans, Mira's brother, wasn't an agronomist. He was a nobody. In a good way. He was just a guy, 22 years old. He didn't know how to do anything special, but he did whatever he was told. He hauled dirt, he hauled water, he helped Jean in the workshop. He helped Eunice with the electrical work. He ran to the surface with Hesso for supplies. Quiet, diligent, dependable. Dan valued people like that. Not everyone has to be a specialist. Someone just has to be dependable. The days passed. The farm grew. Slowly. Mira complained about the light. The system's lamps gave off a steady white light. The plants needed a warmer spectrum. Jonas shook his head and, in 2 days, made an improvised light filter out of a car and colored glass found on the surface into an improvised light filter. The light turned yellowish. Mira looked at him and smiled for the first time. She said it would do. The sprouts did indeed grow faster. By the 20th day, the farm yielded its first harvest. A small one, a handful of greens, leaves resembling spinach. Bitter, tough, but edible. Mira chopped them up and added them to boiling water. Resulted in something like a soup. Sua said it was tasty. Everyone knew it wasn't. But Sua said it was tasty, and no one argued. On the 22nd day, Dan went far away, 10 kilometers north. He was looking for a specific thing, a hardware store or a warehouse. He needed pipes, real pipes, plastic or metal, to expand the water supply and for the shelter's future sewer system. 10 people produce waste. A bucket of ashes isn't enough anymore. We need a system. He didn't find a store. He found something better. A distribution center. A huge building on the edge of the industrial zone. The roof was half collapsed. The walls were still standing. Inside were rows of shelves. Most were empty, looted. But in the far corner, behind a collapsed section of shelving, was something the looters hadn't been able to get to. Dan crawled through the rubble. Hesso watched his back from outside. She didn't want to let him go alone, but she needed to watch the approaches. An open road ran past the center. You could see far. Dan squeezed through a gap between the fallen shelving and the wall. A small space opened up behind him. And there. Pipes. Plastic. Different diameters. 5 bundles of 10 each. Each pipe 3 meters long. 150 meters of pipes. He sat and looked at them, and almost cried. 150 meters of pipes is a full-fledged sewer system. It's an extension of the water supply. It's a condensate drainage system. It's life. The problem is that it's far away and heavy. 50 kilograms of pipes over 10 kilometers through the ruins. Not one trip. 10, 20. We need a cart. We need people. We need logistics. Dan wrote down the coordinates and returned. In the evening, he gathered everyone in the corridor, the shelter's first general meeting. 10 people stood and sat in the narrow corridor, 20 centimeters wide, and listened. Dan talked about the pipes, about the distance, about the need to organize delivery. Jean said he could make a cart out of car wheels and rebar. Hesso said she would provide security for the route. Jonas said he would go as a loader. Tom said the same. Mira said she would stay with the farm and the children. Lena said she would stay at the medical station. Her leg was still in a splint. Oscar, the teenager, said he wanted to go. Jonas looked at his son. Sarah looked at her son. Oscar looked at Dan. Dan thought for 3 seconds. Then he nodded. Let him go. He's 15. In this world, people grow up quickly or not at all. The operation took 4 days. Jean put together a cart overnight. Heavy, creaky, but functional. Wheels from a passenger car, a frame made of rebar. The platform was made of planks. Not pretty, functional. Dan went on the first run with Hezo, Jonas and Tom. Oscar stayed for the second run. 10 kilometers there, loading, 10 back, with a heavy cart along a broken road. Hezo walked ahead, a spear in her hand. Her eyes scanned the horizon. Halfway back, she raised her hand. Everyone froze. Movement on the left, behind the ruins of a building. Hezo gestured for Dan and the others to press themselves against the wall. She went forward herself, silently. A minute, 2. She returned, said there was a group there, 5 people, armed, moving in a parallel line. They didn't notice us, or pretended not to notice. Dan made a decision. A detour. Add a kilometer, but get away from the group. Safety is more important than speed. They took a detour. They returned to the shelter 2 hours later than planned, but they returned in one piece, with 30 meters of pipe on the cart. 3 trips, 4 days, 150 meters of pipe in the shelter's storage room. Dan stood looking at the stack of plastic pipes and thought it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen in this world. More beautiful than crystal mushrooms. More beautiful than the iodine-colored sunset sky. The pipes. White plastic. Smooth. Intact. An instrument of civilization. He began installing the plumbing the next day. Jonas helped with the layout. Jean cut the pipes with a hacksaw found on the surface. Dan designed and assembled. 3 days of work. The bathroom now had a real drain. The water flowed through the pipe into a drainage well that Dan had built as a separate room in the system below the main level. 10 coins that had come from the new residents over the past week. 2 vagrants that Hesso found on her way back from the 3rd trip for pipes. A man and a woman, elderly, exhausted. They were walking from nowhere to nowhere. Hesso brought them to Dan. Dan let them down into the shelter. The system's voice credited 20 coins, 12 residents. The first month was coming to an end. Dan sat in the workshop and did the math. 14 rooms, 12 residents. The farm is running. The water system is running. The sewage system is running. Electricity from batteries. Jonas found 2 more on the surface. Enough for lighting the workshop and the medical station. The system provides light in the living quarters. Ventilation is stable. The air is fresh. By the standards of this world, they lived well. Very well. By the standards of the world before the rift, this would have been a basement. But here and now, it was more than 90% of the survivors on the surface had. Dan opened the last unopened can of food and wrote, Month 1. Summary. 14 rooms, 12 residents. Basic but functional infrastructure. The team is forming. Engineer, carpenter, electrician, warrior, agronomist, medic. 6 key skills, each one indispensable. Next goal, 20 rooms, 20 residents. A full-fledged farm, a generator, a medical clinic, a school. 1 month deadline. He set the package aside. Lena was standing in the doorway. He didn't know how long she'd been standing there. She said he needed to sleep. He hadn't slept in over a day. Dan said he needed to finish the calculations. Lena walked over and took the pencil from his hand. She just pulled it out of his fingers. Dan looked at her. She said the calculations weren't going anywhere, and his body wasn't a concrete wall. It breaks. Dan wanted to object, but he looked at his hands. They were red from burns caused by the salt storm, scraped raw from working on the pipes, shaking with exhaustion. He stood up, went to his room, 3 by 3. He lay down on the floor. He fell asleep in 10 seconds. He dreamed of concrete, clean, smooth concrete. He was walking down an endless corridor that he himself had built. The walls were smooth. The light was warm. Behind every door, someone's life. He heard laughter and voices and the sound of running water. He walked, and the corridor never ended. And that was good. The second month began with strangers. Dan was sitting in the workshop designing the second level of the shelter when Hesso walked in and said there were people upstairs. 4 of them, armed, standing by the hatch and not leaving. Dan went upstairs. Hesso followed behind him, a spear in her hand. 4 men stood in a semicircle in front of the hatch, dressed identically. Gray jackets, stripes on the sleeves, a piece of granite embroidered with white thread. The Granite Syndicate. Dan knew about them from Jean, former military bases united into a trading empire. They sell protection, a monopoly on security in the northern sector. The eldest of the 4 stepped forward, short, stocky, weather-beaten face, calm eyes, a professional. He introduced himself as Sergeant Kovac. He said the syndicate knew about the underground settlement. He said that any settlement in the northern sector was required to sign a protection contract with the syndicate. The cost of the contract was 30% of all resources, paid monthly. Dan listened. Then he asked what exactly the syndicate would be protecting them from. Kovac said, from the beasts, from gangs, from salt storms, from everything. Dan asked what would happen if they refused. Kovac smiled. He said that then the syndicate couldn't guarantee that someone wouldn't accidentally find out the location of the shelter. That information has a way of spreading, that there are bad people who come after those who refuse protection. Dan understood. This isn't an offer. It's extortion. Pay up, or we'll set the very people we're offering to protect on you. He looked at Hesso. She stood motionless. Her spear pointed into the ground, but her fingers were white from the grip. She was waiting for his decision. Dan turned to Kovac and said no, calmly, without a challenge, just no. Kovac stopped smiling. He looked at Dan, then at Hesso, then at the hatch in the ground. He said he would relay the answer to command. He said he hoped Dan would change his mind. Then the 4 of them turned and walked away, unhurriedly, confidently, like people who know they'll be back. Hesso waited until they disappeared behind the ruins. Then she said that Dan had just made an enemy with 300 fighters and armored vehicles. Dan said he knew. Hesso said there were 12 of them and half couldn't even hold a weapon. Dan said he knew that too. Hesso looked at him. She asked what the plan was. Dan said the plan was the second level, deeper, safer, with corridors that worked for them, not for those trying to get in. Hesso didn't understand. Dan went down to the workshop and unfolded a blueprint in front of her. The second level of the shelter, 14 meters deep, connected to the first level by a single staircase. The staircase is narrow, one person at a time. At the top of the stairs is a vestibule with a door that can be locked. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is the corridors. Dan didn't design the second-level corridors as straight lines. He designed them as funnels, a wide entrance, gradual narrowing, turns every 5 meters, dead ends, false passages. A person who doesn't know the layout will get lost. A person who does will get through in a minute. Hesso looked at the blueprint. Then she raised her head and looked at Dan with new eyes. She said this wasn't architecture. It's a trap. Dan said it was one and the same. A building that can't be defended isn't worth building. Hesso was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said she wanted to be involved in the design. She knows how people move in enclosed spaces, how they attack, how they retreat, where to set an ambush, where to leave the illusion of an exit so the enemy would run right there. Dan handed her a pencil. They sat over the blueprint until dawn. 2 professionals, an engineer and a warrior. He understood loads and materials. She understood tactics and the movement of bodies. Together, they created something the world had never seen before. Defensive architecture. A corridor that was a weapon in itself. Building the second level would cost 40 coins. Dan had 12. They needed people. Lots of people. And fast. Because the syndicate would return. Kovac said he'd pass the answer on to command. That meant 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then it wouldn't be 4 men coming with an offer. It would be 20 men coming with weapons. Dan started going to the surface every day, sometimes twice. Hesso went with him. They expanded the search area, 15 kilometers in every direction. They were looking for survivors. Every person is 10 coins. Every 10 coins is a room. Every room is a step toward safety. On the 3rd day, they found a group of 5 people, 3 women and 2 men. Caravanners who had lost their caravan. They'd been robbed a week ago. Everything taken. Food, water, weapons. Only their lives were left. They were heading north with no destination, just walking, because stopping meant dying. Dan offered them shelter. They agreed without hesitation, too hungry and weak to doubt. 50 coins. The system rang in Dan's head like a bell. He built 5 rooms that evening. The second level began to take shape. A staircase down, a vestibule, the first corridor, a bend, another one, rooms on either side. On the 7th day of the 2nd month, 3 more arrived, loners, one by one. The first was an elderly man who had heard from the caravanners about the underground shelter with water and food. He came on his own. The second was a young man without an arm. He'd lost it in a fight with a mutated bear. The third was a woman carrying a child, an infant. She had walked for 3 days without water. Her milk was gone. The child didn't cry. He didn't have the strength to cry. Lena took the baby. Something broke in her face when she held him. Dan saw it. He didn't look for more than a second. He turned away, gave her space. Mira brewed a decoction of greens and roots, liquid, warm, nutritious. Lena fed the baby from a spoon, drop by drop. An hour later, the child cried, loudly, demandingly. Lena smiled. For the first time, a real smile. A baby's cry means life. 30 coins from 3 new residents, plus the baby. Another 10. 40. Dan was building. The second level was growing. Corridors, rooms, turns, dead ends. Hesso checked every corridor personally. She walked through them with her eyes closed. She counted her steps. If she could walk through without opening her eyes, it meant the corridor was designed correctly. A defender must know their home in the dark. By the middle of the second month, there were 20 or 30 residents, 26 rooms on 2 levels. Mira's farm had expanded. Now there were 3 garden beds, greens, root vegetables, and the first attempts to grow something resembling beans. Jonas assembled a second generator from a car engine and a hand crank. 2 people turn the crank. The generator produces electricity. 1 hour of operation provides 4 hours of light. Not efficient, but it works. Jean built furniture for every room. Beds made of rebar and planks. Shelves, stools. Simple, rough, but every piece is made to fit the height and needs of a specific person. He remembered. Who was tall? Who was short? Who had a bad back? Who needed an armrest? Dan noticed this and thought that Jean understood the same thing he did. To build for a specific person, not for an abstract inhabitant. Lena organized a medical station, a real one, a 3-by-4-foot room, a shelf with medicines, not much, bandages and antiseptic, painkillers found on the surface, herbal decoctions from Mira, improvised splints made from rebar. Lena kept records, every patient, every complaint, every treatment. She'd picked up Dan's habit, documentation. In this world, knowledge dies with the bearer, so it must be written down. One evening, Lena was sitting in the medical station, bandaging the arm of one of the former caravan drivers. Dan walked by and stopped in the doorway. Lena worked calmly, confidently, as if she'd done it 1,000 times. And she had. Before the rift, she was a paramedic. After the rift, she became the one who sews up wounds with threads from clothing and sets bones without anesthesia. She looked up and saw Dan. She asked why he was standing there. Dan said he was thinking about where to set up a clinic, a real one, not a room, but an entire wing, with wards, with an isolation ward for the contagious, with an operating room. Lena stopped bandaging. She looked at him. She asked if he was serious. Dan said he was absolutely serious. The clinic's ventilation had to be separate from the general system, a quarantine circuit. If an infection entered the shelter, the clinic had to be isolated from the rest of the premises within a minute. Negative pressure in the wards. Air is drawn in rather than expelled outward. Contaminated air is vented through filters into the drainage system. Lena was listening. The caravan driver was listening too. Lena said she'd never heard the term quarantine loop. Dan said that in his world, it was standard for hospitals. In the world before the rift. Lena was silent for a moment. Then she said she liked his world. It's a shame it broke. Dan wanted to say that it was the same world, just 40 years later, but he didn't say it. Because she was right. The world had broken, and he was trying to put at least one small piece back together. That same evening, Dan began sketching out the clinic. A wing on the 2nd level, 4 wards, an isolation room, an operating room, a medicine storage room, separate ventilation, a quarantine loop. On paper, it looked like a district hospital design. In reality, it would be concrete rooms with beds made of rebar and instruments fashioned from whatever materials were at hand. But the system would work. Because the system was designed by an engineer who knows that proper ventilation is more important than a pretty facade. On the 20th day of the 2nd month, Dan stood at the entrance to the shelter. Upstairs, evening. The iodine-colored sky was darkening. The crystalline mushrooms on the ruins were beginning to glow brighter. Night was approaching. It's more dangerous on the surface at night. The creatures come out of the basements. The ones that are worse than the daytime ones. Dan stood and looked at the horizon. Somewhere up there to the north was the granite syndicate. 300 fighters, armored vehicles, organization, discipline. They would come. It wasn't a question of if, but when. He went downstairs, closed the hatch, walked down the first-level corridor, past the storeroom, past Jean's workshop from which came the sound of hammering, past Lena's medical station, past Mira's farm where the green light of the filter illuminated rows of sprouts. He went down to the second level, walked down the funnel-shaped corridor, turns, narrowings, his corridors, his traps. He entered his workroom on the second level. He hung a new blueprint on the wall, the infirmary, next to the blueprints of the defensive corridors, next to the ventilation diagram, next to the surface map. He sat down. He looked at the wall. 23 residents, people who trust him, who sleep peacefully because they believe the walls will hold, that the air will be clean, that water will flow in the morning, that Dan had thought of everything. He couldn't let them down. He took out a pencil and began to calculate. How many coins were needed for the infirmary? How many for reinforcing the entrance? How many for the third level? How many people he needed to find to get those coins? And how much time he had before the syndicate decided that diplomacy was over? The 30th day. A month since waking up. Dan counted and couldn't believe his own numbers. 30 residents, 32 rooms on 2 levels, a fully functioning farm, 2 generators, running water, sewage, a medical station, a workshop, a pantry with a week's worth of food. A month ago, he'd woken up on a concrete floor in a 3-by-3-foot room. Now he had a small underground settlement. Mira's hydroponic garden yielded a harvest every 10 days. Small, but steady. Greens, root vegetables, the beans were finally coming in. Protein. Real plant protein. Mira walked around the farm and talked to every sprout. Dan watched her from the hallway. She was kneeling in front of the garden bed, whispering something. Quietly. Gently. Like a mother over a cradle. Then she looked up and saw Dan. She blushed. He said he needed to discuss expanding the farm with her. A 3rd room. More garden beds. More light. We need an irrigation system. Not manual, but at least semi-automatic. Pipes with holes through which water drips onto the beds. Drip irrigation. Mira listened and nodded. Then she said she knew one thing. Crystalline mushrooms on the surface. Their spores. If ground up and added to water in very small amounts, they work as fertilizer. She'd seen it among the nomads. Dangerous. Too much and the plants mutate. But just a little bit, and they grow twice as fast. Dan wrote it down. Then he asked how she knew that. Mira said she grew up in a group that grew food in bags on their backs. They experimented with everything they found. The crystalline spores were one of their discoveries. Half the group died from the mutated plants when someone overdid the dosage. The rest learned their lesson. Dan looked at her. She's 19. She lost half her family because of a mistake in the spore dosage. And now she calmly talks about it while kneeling in front of a garden bed in an underground shelter. This world turns children into old people. He said they'd give it a try. Carefully. With documentation. Every experiment is recorded. Every dosage is logged. Mira nodded. Then she smiled. Quietly. Just the corners of her lips. And she went to her seedlings. Tom, her brother, was working with Jean in the workshop. They'd built a second cart. Lighter than the first. Faster. From bicycle parts and sheet metal. Tom wasn't an expert at anything, but he was the kind of person who showed up at 6 in the morning and left last. Reliable. Quiet. Like a load-bearing beam in a floor. You can't see it, but without it, everything would collapse. On the 32nd day, Dan finished building the clinic. 4 wards, an isolation room, an operating room, separate ventilation with a quarantine circuit. Lena stood in the center of the new clinic and said nothing. She slowly walked around each ward. She touched the walls. She peeked into the isolation room. She checked how. Tightly. Airtight. Then she went into the operating room. A table made of concrete blocks. A smooth surface. Light from above. A shelf for instruments. She stood in the middle and didn't move for a minute. Then she turned to Dan and said that in her entire life after the rift, not once had anyone built a place for her where she could heal. Everyone had always built a place to hide, or a place to fight. No one had built a place to heal. Dan said that healing was more important. She looked at him so intently that he looked away. Not out of awkwardness, out of something else, something he didn't want to name yet. On the 35th day, what Dan had been waiting for happened, and what he had been afraid of. In the morning, Hesso returned from reconnaissance with news. Dust on the horizon. A column, moving from the north, straight toward them. The syndicate. Dan called a meeting. Hesso, Lena, Jin, Jonas, Mira. 6 people in his office. He spread out a map. He pointed out where, according to Hesso, the convoy was heading. The estimated route, speed, approximate numbers. Hesso said no fewer than 20 fighters, maybe 30. Armed. Organized. This isn't a gang, it's an army. Dan has 30 residents, of whom at most 10 can handle weapons. And those weapons are spears made from pipes and knives against automatic firearms. Lena said they should leave, abandon the shelter and leave. Hesso said no. There's nowhere to run. The surface will kill them faster than the syndicate. Jin was silent. Jonas was silent. Mira stared at the floor. Dan said there was no need to leave. They wouldn't run away, and they wouldn't fight in the open. They would wait. Here. Down here. In their corridors. He stood up and led them to the second level. He showed them the funnel-shaped corridors. He explained the principle. A wide entrance, narrowing, turns, dead ends, false passages. The enemy enters in a group. The corridor narrows. The group stretches out into a chain. At the turns, the chain breaks. Every turn is a point where you can strike. 1 defender at a turn is worth 10 attackers in a narrow space. And the dead ends. Dan pointed out the dead ends. They look like passageways. The enemy enters. The door closes behind him. A concrete door. The system built them. Can't be opened from the outside. The person inside is trapped. Without a weapon, he's useless. Hesso walked through the corridors, touching the walls, checking the corners, the width of the passages, the height of the ceilings. Then she stopped, turned to Dan, said it could be defended. The 3 of them, her, Tom, and Jin. 3 people at key turns, the rest downstairs, safe. Dan nodded. Then he added one more detail, ventilation. Each corridor has a separate ventilation duct. If necessary, the air supply to individual sections can be cut off. Not permanently, for 20 minutes. That's enough for a person in a confined space to start suffocating and lose the ability to fight. Hesso looked at him. She said he was a scary man. Dan said he was an engineer. 3 days to prepare. Hesso positioned her people. 3 fighters at key turns. Homemade barricades made of rebar and concrete blocks. Wire traps on the floor. Simple, but in the darkness of the narrow corridor, they were enough. Dan moved all the supplies to the second level. Food, water, medicines, tools, blueprints, notebooks, everything. The first level became empty, a decoy. The enemy would enter and see empty rooms. They would go deeper, to the second level, and fall into the trap. The syndicate arrived at dawn on the 38th day. 22 fighters. Not 30. But 22 is still twice as many as all the able-bodied men in the shelter. It wasn't Kovac in command. A lieutenant, a young one, ambitious, worse than Kovac. Kovac was a professional. This one was a careerist. They entered through the hatch, one by one. Hesso watched from above through the emergency exit that Dan had built a week earlier. A small hatch 100 meters from the main one, camouflaged. Hesso watched through it. 22 people inside. The first level was empty. They walked through the corridors, found rooms. Empty. The farm. Empty. Mira had moved the garden beds to the second level overnight. They found a staircase leading down. They went down. The lieutenant went first, because he's a careerist. A professional would have sent out a scout. The second level greeted them with a corridor. Wide, inviting. They all went in. 22 people. And the corridor began to narrow. The first turn. The second. The line of 22 stretched out. The front ones went around the corner. The back ones were still on the straight stretch. Voice communication between them didn't work across 2 turns. The echo in the concrete walls drowned out their words. The first 6 people entered a dead end. It looked like a passageway, a wide opening, a room beyond it. They went in. The concrete door closed behind them. Quiet. Tight. 6 people locked in. The next 4 people took a wrong turn. Another dead end. A door. Locked in. 10 out of 22 were taken out of the game without a single shot fired. The remaining 12 realized what was happening. They panicked. They started screaming. They ran back, toward the stairs. At the first turn, Jean was waiting for them with a spear. In a narrow corridor, a spear works better than an automatic rifle. A single direction of attack. A single defender completely blocked the passage. They couldn't shoot. Ricochets off the concrete walls were more dangerous to the shooter than to the target. The 2 in front fell. The rest retreated. They ran back. Another turn. Tom was there. Another spear. Another narrow corridor. They were running around in circles, 12 people in a concrete maze. They didn't know where to go. They didn't know where the enemy was. They didn't know where the exit was. Dan blocked the ventilation in the central section. The air began to run out. Slowly. Breathing with increasing difficulty. 15 minutes later, the lieutenant shouted that he was surrendering. Dan opened the ventilation. Hesso entered through a back entrance and gathered the weapons. 12 assault rifles, 8 pistols, knives, grenades, ammunition. More weapons than Dan had ever seen in his entire life. 22 syndicate fighters sat on the floor in the hallway, unarmed, without pride. The lieutenant looked up at Dan. He asked who he was. Dan said he was an engineer. Then he did something no one expected. He fed them. Bean and vegetable soup from Mira. Hot. A bowl for each of them. 22 syndicate fighters ate soup in the shelter's hallway and said nothing. Then Dan told them they could leave. All of them. Empty-handed, but alive. Or they could stay. Live. Work. Build. Like everyone else. The weapons stay in the shelter. The lieutenant said Colonel Grant wouldn't forgive that. Dan said he knew. 4 out of 22 stayed. 4 former syndicate soldiers. They looked at the shelter walls, at the light from the lamps, at the water from the tap, at the people who weren't afraid, and decided that it was better here than in the syndicate barracks. 18 left, unarmed, on foot, north, back to their own people. Dan stood by the hatch and watched them leave. Hesso stood beside him. She said that 4 new fighters was good, but 18 enemies who had seen the shelter from the inside was bad. Dan said he knew. But he couldn't keep them locked up. This was a shelter, not a prison. Hesso was silent for a moment. Then she said he was either a genius or an idiot. Dan said history would tell. 40 coins from the 4 new residents, plus weapons, real firearms, 12 assault rifles. Hesso held one in her hands and stroked it as if it were alive. She said that now they could truly defend themselves. Dan said the best defense was corridors that prevented the enemy from reaching the people. Hesso said he was right, but an assault rifle wouldn't hurt either. After the assault, Dan hadn't slept for 2 days, not out of fear, out of work. 18 people had left and seen the shelter. They'd seen the first level. They saw the entrance to the second. They saw part of the corridors. That meant everything they saw had to be changed, rebuilt, remade. Dan sat in the workshop and redrew the plan of the first level. New rooms, new corridors, false entrances, traps that weren't there before. The system gave him coins, and he spent them with a surgeon's precision. Every room in the right place, every turn at the right angle. He completely rebuilt the entrance section. The old hatch now led to an empty room. The real entrance had been moved 200 meters to the east. The new hatch was disguised as a piece of broken concrete slab. Only the residents knew where it was. 4 former syndicate soldiers had settled into life at the shelter faster than Dan had expected. The oldest of them, Rick Morale, a 32-year-old former sergeant, turned out to be more than just a fighter. He knew how to repair weapons, take them apart, assemble them, make cartridges from casings and lead. Hesso and Rick hit it off within the first day. 2 professionals of war. They spoke the same language, the language of distances, firing sectors, and dead zones. Dan listened to their conversations and jotted down what he could use in the architecture. A firing sector is not just about weapons, it's about angles of visibility, about how to design a corridor so that the defender sees the enemy before the enemy sees him. A week had passed since the assault, then another. The syndicate hadn't returned. Yet. Dan made use of every day. On the 45th day, there were 34 residents in the shelter, 40 rooms on 2 levels, and Dan began digging the 3rd. Not with machinery, with his hands. Jonas and Jean and Tom and 3 volunteer residents went down to the lower of the 2nd level and dug, with sheet metal shovels, with rebar picks, slowly, hardly. The soil was wet, sandy, crumbling. Dan designed wall reinforcements from planks and sheets of metal found on the surface, temporary, until there were enough coins for the system to pour concrete. But they had to dig now, because the 3rd level was 20 meters deep. It was safer at 20 meters, further from the surface, further from the crack, further from everything that wanted to kill them. On the 48th day, a girl came to the shelter, alone, about 12 years old. She stood by the new entrance and waited silently. Hesso found her during her rounds. She brought her to Dan. The girl didn't speak, not at all. She stared at people without blinking. Dan crouched down in front of her. He asked her name. Silence. He asked where she came from. Silence. Lena approached. She examined the girl. Physically healthy, exhausted, dehydrated, but no wounds or broken bones. Lena gave her water. The girl drank greedily. Then she took the bowl of soup from Mira's hands. She ate slowly, neatly. After the meal, Lena took her to the ward and put her to bed. The girl fell asleep instantly, as if she hadn't slept in a week. Maybe that was the case. System voice. Resident added. Name unknown. Age approximately 12 years old. 10 coins. The system accepted her even without a name. Dan thought the system was smarter than it seemed. Or kinder. The girl didn't speak on the 2nd day or the 3rd, but on the 4th she came to Jean's workshop. She stood in the doorway and watched him work. Jean paid no attention. He continued planing the board, but sawing. An hour later, the girl walked over and sat down next to him. 2 hours later, Jean handed her a small piece of wood and a knife. She took it. She began to carve. Clumsily. Slowly. But with concentration. By evening, she had something resembling a bird in her hands. Crooked. Funny. But resembling one. Jin looked and nodded. It was the first time anyone had seen a reaction from her. She almost smiled. Suah befriended her the next day. Suah befriended everyone in the shelter. She was 10 years old. She ran through the hallways, chatted with everyone, brought water to Mira at the farm, helped Lee stack the ketis. She sat next to Hesso while she cleaned her weapons. Suah was the first child of the shelter and the only person whom everyone, without exception, loved. The mute girl got her name from Suah. Suah named her Nari, because Nari means lily, and the girl, in Suah's opinion, resembled a lily. Quiet and beautiful. Dan didn't argue. Nari it is, then. On the 50th day, Dan built something that changed the shelter forever. He had been planning it for a long time. From the very first day, when he saw Lena lying in the darkness of a 3x3 concrete box, staring at the ceiling with empty eyes. People cannot live underground without light. Not electric light, natural light, or at least the illusion of natural light. Jonas helped with the technical side. LEDs from the surface, soldered out of car dashboards and billboards, colored glass, a diffuser made of translucent plastic, a control unit consisting of a primitive circuit that slowly changes the brightness and color. Dan designed the housing, a rectangle 60 by 40 centimeters, built into the wall. Behind the plastic diffuser, the LEDs create a soft, warm light, golden, fading to orange, then to pink, then to purple, then slowly fading out. A 20-minute cycle, a fake sunset. Dan installed the first one in the common room on the second level, where people gathered in the evenings, where they ate, where they talked. He turned it on in the evening without warning. The light came on, soft, golden. People fell silent. One of the former caravan women stood up and walked over to the wall. She reached out her hand. She touched the plastic diffuser. She stood and watched. The light shifted from gold to orange, warm, like a real sunset behind a window that isn't there. Suah pressed herself against her father and watched. Ree stood in the corner, and for the first time since arriving at the shelter, her expression changed. Not a smile, but something close to it. Something like a memory of something good that had happened long ago. The old man from the caravanners, the one who had come with the group in the second month, sat on a stool that Jin had made specifically to fit his height, with an armrest for his bad back. He watched the fake sunset, and tears streamed down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He said the last time he saw a sunset was 20 years ago, before the sky turned the color of iodine forever. He said he'd forgotten what it looked like. He said he thought he'd never see one again. Lena stood in the doorway and looked at Dan. Dan stood in the far corner of the room, with his back to the wall. He looked at the people, at their faces in the warm light. He wasn't looking at the sunset. He was looking at those for whom he had built it. Lena walked over. She stood beside him. She said quietly, "You gave them the sun." Dan said it wasn't the sun. It was LEDs and plastic and a simple electrical circuit. Lena said that to them, it was the sun, and that the difference didn't matter. Dan said nothing. He knew she was right, because he remembered, in a past life, in the worlds before the rift, when he designed bunkers for annoyed millionaires. The most common request wasn't the thickness of the walls or the air supply. The most common request was whether a window could be installed, an underground window, so it would seem like there was a sky beyond it. People paid millions for the illusion of a sky, because a person cannot live without a horizon, without a sunset, without the feeling that the world continues beyond the wall. Dan knew this, and he built it here. Not for millions, for 10 coins per room and an evening's work by Jonas. The next day, 3 people approached Dan separately and asked for the same window in their rooms. Then 4 more. Then everyone. Dan took down the orders. Jonas wrote down the technical specifications. Jean started making the frames. A factory of fake sunsets. A week later, there were windows in every living room of the shelter. 34 windows. 34 sunsets every evening. People would come out into the hallways when the lights came on. They'd stand by the open doors. They'd look at each other in the warm golden light. They'd smile. They'd talk more quietly than usual, as if they were afraid of scaring it away. Dan watched from his room, 3 by 3. The first room. He hadn't put a window in his room. Jonas asked why. Dan said he didn't need one. Jonas didn't believe him, but he didn't argue. The truth was that Dan didn't need an illusion. He needed reality, concrete, blueprints, numbers, people behind the wall. That was his sunset, every evening. On the 53rd day, a new group arrived, 7 of them, 3 adults and 4 children. They'd heard about the underground city from those very same released syndicate soldiers. One of the 18, instead of returning to the barracks, had headed south. He told the caravan drivers. The caravan drivers told the nomads. Rumors spread. 70 coins, 7 new residents. Dan was building. The 3rd level was taking shape. The system was pouring concrete into what people had dug out by hand. The skeleton was becoming a structure. The void was becoming a home. 41 residents, 53 rooms, 3 levels, and this was only the beginning. On the 60th day, Dan realized the shelter needed a school. He realized this when he saw Sua teaching Nari to count. They were sitting in the hallway. Sua was drawing numbers on the floor with a piece of chalk she'd found on the surface. Nari was watching, nodding, writing beside her, crooked, hesitantly, but writing. Sua clapped her hands after every correct number. Dan stopped and watched for a minute. There were 7 children in the shelter, 4 from the last group, Sua, Nari, the infant whom Lena was feeding with a spoon and who was now smiling and reaching out his hands to everyone who approached. 7 children who cannot read, cannot count, know nothing about the world as it was. For them, the world is wasteland and ruins and beasts and hunger. It is not their fault that they were born after the rift, but if no one teaches them, the world will remain that way forever. Dan built a classroom, a 4 by 5 foot room on the 2nd level, a fake window on the wall, benches made of planks, a teacher's desk, a shelf for books that aren't there yet, a blackboard made of a sheet of metal painted chalk. He had 1 piece of chalk. Dan went up to the surface and spent half the day in the ruins of the former school. He found a box of chalk. 12 pieces. White. Intact. Preserved by time and the dryness of the basement. He found 3 textbooks. Math, biology, history. The pages were yellowed. The covers had disintegrated. But the text was legible. He brought it all back to the shelter and placed it on a shelf in the classroom. 3 books, 12 pieces of chalk, the beginning of a library, the beginning of a school, the beginning of the future. Now they needed a teacher. Among the 41 residents, there wasn't a single professional educator. Lena knew how to teach medicine. Jonas could teach electricity. Mira knew botany. But the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, logic, who would teach these? Dan thought about it for 2 days. Then he decided he would teach them himself for now, in the evenings, after his main job. He's an engineer. He knows math. He knows physics. He knows logic. He'll explain reading and writing. Not professionally, a bit clumsily, but better than nothing. He held his first lesson on the 63rd day. 7 children in the class. Sua in the front row, Nari next to her, 4 from the last group, a baby in its mother's arms in the corner. The mother came to listen. 2 other adults beside her. Oscar Berg, 15 years old, and Tom Evans, 22 years old. They sat in the back rows and said they wanted to learn too. Oscar because he'd never gone to school. He was born 3 years after the crack. Tom because he could read but had forgotten half the letters. 9 students. Dan stood in front of the blackboard. He picked up a piece of chalk. He wrote the number 1, then 2, then 3. Then he turned and saw their faces. And he realized that this was more important than any hallway and any farm and any fake window. Because hallways protect. Arms feed. Windows comfort. But school builds people who will then build everything else themselves. Dan taught them every evening for 2 hours. Math, reading from the 3 textbooks he found. Physics using his fingers. Why does water flow down? Why doesn't light pass through concrete? Why does air move from warm to cold? The children listened with their mouths agape. For them, every fact was a revelation. Sua asked the most questions. Why? What for? How? Where from? Nari didn't speak, but wrote. In every lesson, she filled sheets of paper that Dan had cut from packaging he'd found on the surface. In neat, small handwriting. Notes. Nari was taking notes. Dan saw this and stopped. He looked at the sheets. Neat lines, numbers, diagrams. This girl wasn't just listening. She was documenting. Just like him. He didn't say anything. But that evening, for the first time, he thought that maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe someone would pick up his notebooks when he was gone. On the 65th day, Dan ran into a problem he couldn't solve with a drawing, an internal conflict. It had been brewing for a long time, ever since the population had passed 30. Who to let in? Every week, people came to the shelter, in pairs, in threes, sometimes in groups. Rumors spread across the wasteland, and they came to them, the wounded, the hungry, the sick, the old, the young, the strong, the weak. They all wanted one thing: a dry night, a roof over their heads, water, food, safety. Dan has 41 residents, 53 rooms. The farm feeds 35 people. 6 are on reduced rations. There's enough water. There's enough air. But the farm can't keep up with the growing population. Every new person is a mouth to feed, and a pair of hands. But a mouth eats right away, while hands only start to be useful after a week. Hesso came to him in the workshop that evening and said it straight out. We need to be selective. We can't take everyone who comes along. The shelter isn't a charity. Every new resident has to be useful. Fighters, medics, engineers, builders, not old people who can't work, not sick people who drain the infirmary's resources, not children who just eat. Dan listened. Then he said that children are the future. Hesso said there would be no future if they all died of starvation in 2 months. Fair. Logical. and cruel. Lena walked in 10 minutes later, as if she knew what they were talking about. Maybe she did. The walls are thin. Lena said that if the shelter starts choosing who to save, it's no different from the syndicate. The syndicate chooses too. Pay or die. If Dan starts turning people away because they're useless, it's the same logic. Hesso looked at Lena. Lena looked at Hesso. Dan stood between them and felt the air in the room grow heavy. Two truths, both real, both painful. He couldn't choose. Because Hesso is right. Resources are finite. If we take everyone, the farm won't be able to handle it. People will start starving. They'll start getting sick. They'll start getting angry. They'll start leaving, or worse. And Lena is right. If we start choosing, who decides? Who is useful and who isn't? The old caravan driver is useless by Hesso's standards, but he sits in the hallway every evening and tells the children stories. Stories about the world that existed before the rift. The children listen with their mouths agape. They learn that there used to be a sky, blue. There were trees, green. There were cities where millions of people lived without fear. This is useless by the metrics, and priceless in essence. Dan made his decision 3 days later, a compromise. As an engineer, he solved the problem not by choosing, but by expanding. Not who to let in, but how to build up resources faster. Mira's farm got 2 more rooms, 6 garden beds, crystalline spores in microdoses as fertilizer. Yield doubled. A second water intake point in the collector. More water, more irrigation, more food. A hunting party. Hesso and Rick and 2 fighters. Every other day to the surface. Mutated animals. Meat. Not all of them are edible, but some are. Mira checked every piece, tested it. If it doesn't mutate within a day, it's safe. The first meat in the shelter's diet. Bitter, tough, stringy, high in calories, protein, fat, energy. Dan established a rule. Every new resident works on the farm for the first week. No exceptions. The elderly, children over 10, the wounded if they can move their arms. Not a punishment, an initiation. Everyone must understand where food comes from. Everyone must grow at least 1 sprout with their own hands. Then they won't complain about the portions. Hesso agreed to the decision. Not happily, but she agreed. Lena nodded, not happily either. A compromise, by definition, pleases no one. But it works. On the 70th day, the population exceeded 50. 53 residents, 61 rooms, 3 levels. The farm fed everyone. Barely, but everyone. Dan sat on the floor of his 3-by-3-foot room. The walls were covered with blueprints. A map of the surface took up 1 entire wall. A list of residents took up another. Ventilation and water supply diagrams took up a third. The 4th wall was empty. Dan looked at it, an empty wall. A place for something new. He thought about that had been spinning in his head for a week. About the fact that he couldn't be the only one who designs, the only one who sees the system as a whole, the only one who knows how to build it right. If he died tomorrow, the shelter would keep running. Water would flow, lights would stay on, the farm would produce. But no one would build a new corridor correctly. No one would calculate the load on the floor. No one would design the quarantine circuit for the new wing. His knowledge would die with him, just as the knowledge of everyone in this world had been dying for 40 years. He needed an apprentice, not an assistant, not a pair of working hands, an apprentice, someone who will think like him, design like him, see the system like him. Dan opened the last blank page and began writing the training program. The Shelter Engineering School. Course 1. Fundamentals. What is load? What compression and tension are? Why an arch holds while a straight beam breaks. How to calculate airflow. How to design a drain. Basic things. The foundation, upon which everything else can be built. He posted a notice in the common room, a sheet of paper with writing on it. Enrollment in the engineering school. Requirements. Must be able to count to 1,000. Must be able to read. Must be willing to study 3 hours every day. 4 people applied. Oscar Berg, a 15-year-old teenager who had been attending Dan's classes since day 1. Tom Evans, a reliable, quiet, hard worker who wanted to be something more. One of the former, named Daria, 30 years old, a former accountant before the shatter. She can count better than anyone in the shelter. And Nari, a 12-year-old mute girl who took notes in every class and drew patterns on the walls of her room in her spare time. Patterns that, upon closer inspection, turned out to be diagrams of ventilation. She had copied them from Dan's blueprints from memory. Dan looked at the 4 of them, then at the blueprints on the walls, then back at the 4 of them. He said they would start tomorrow. First lesson. Why concrete cracks? Oscar raised his hand and asked why they were starting with that. Dan said it was because the first thing an engineer needs to know is how things break. Only someone who understands how can build it so it doesn't break. The 4 nodded. The school opened. The 3rd month brought changes Dan hadn't planned for. On the 75th day, a caravan appeared on the horizon. Not a small group of refugees. A real caravan. 12 people. Carts loaded with goods. Guards. A banner on a pole. White cloth with a blue circle. Hesso saw them first. She reported to Dan. He came up to the surface. The caravan stopped 300 meters from the entrance and waited. They didn't come any closer. These weren't refugees. They were merchants. The caravan leader stepped forward and raised his hands, a gesture of peace. Dan walked toward him, Hesso behind him. Rick, with an automatic rifle, was on the roof of the nearest building. The caravan leader introduced himself as Won Tae-il, 60 years old, thin, wiry, quick eyes, intelligent. He said he'd heard about the shelter, that he'd heard about the man building underground, that he wanted to trade. Dan asked what he had. Won Tae-il smiled and began to list them. Seeds, real seeds, wheat, rice, soybeans, tomatoes, potatoes, medicines, antibiotics, real ones, not expired, produced in the Han Tower laboratories. Tools, saws, hand-cranked drills, drill bits, bolts, nuts, hardware. Fabric, shoes, paper, a whole ream of paper, 500 sheets, white, blank. Dan looked at the list and thought he must have misheard. All of this is incredibly expensive in the post-crack world. Won Tae-il wants something incredibly valuable in return. Dan asked what the price was. Won Tae-il said the price was simple, dry nights. He wants a contract. His caravan travels the route from Han Tower to the foothills of the Syndicate and back. The route takes 3 months. There's nowhere safe to spend the night along the way. Every night is a lottery. Monsters, storms, bandits. He lost men on every trip. If the refuge became a stop on his route, a place where the caravan could spend the night, for 2 nights, once every month and a half, he would pay in goods. Every time. Dan did the math. A caravan of 12 people for 2 nights is 24 person nights. A place, food, water, safety, resources. But in return, seeds and medicines and tools that are impossible to find on the surface. Dan agreed. They shook hands. Won Tae-il led the caravan to the entrance. 12 people descended into the shelter. Hesso watched every one of them. Rick, too. The caravan members left their weapons upstairs, Dan's rule. Inside the shelter, only those who live here carry weapons. The caravan members saw the corridors, the rooms, the farm, the infirmary, fake windows with a sunset view, water from the tap. They were silent. Then one of them said it was a city, a real city, underground. One tail looked at Dan and said the rumors hadn't lied. Then he added that the rumors hadn't even told half of it. The caravan spent 2 nights in the shelter. They slept in the guest rooms that Dan had built specifically for this purpose. 4 rooms on the first level, by the entrance. Separate ventilation, separate bathroom. Isolated from the main shelter in case the guests turned out to be something they weren't. Hesso approved the layout. The caravan members ate hot soup. They washed with hot water. Eunice put together a simple water heater from a copper pipe and lit that fire. Primitive, but the water was warm. One of the caravanners stood under the stream and didn't move for 10 minutes. Then he came out and said those were the best 10 minutes he'd had in the last year. When the caravan left on the 3rd day, Dan stood in the storeroom and counted. 5 sacks of seeds. Different kinds. Real cultivated plants, not the wild roots Mira had before. A box of antibiotics. Lena held it like a baby. 20 vials. Each one could save a life. Tools. Gene was laying them out on the workshop shelf, and his hands were shaking. Real tools. Not rebar with a knife taped to it. Saws, drills, bolts, and paper. 500 sheets. Dan picked up a stack, held it in his hands. White, smooth, clean. He had almost forgotten what it was like. To write on real paper instead of the back of labels. He sat down in the workshop and began sketching on real paper with a real pencil. The plan for the 4th level. And for the first time in 3 months, the lines came out straight. Not because the paper was better, because his hand had stopped trembling from exhaustion. Because for the first time in 3 months, he sat down and drew not in a rush between trips to the surface, but calmly, knowing that there was food in the pantry for 2 weeks, that there were medicines in the infirmary, that real tomatoes and potatoes were growing on the farm, that the walls were still standing, people were alive, and the system was working. Mira received the seeds and became a different person. She walked around the farm and made plans. Wheat here, soybeans here, tomatoes here. Potatoes need a separate room. Deep beds, more soil, less light. She sketched her plans on paper next to Dan, 2 drawings side by side. His was architectural, hers was agronomic. He designed rooms, she designed what would grow in them. They worked in silence, side by side. Sometimes Mira asked a question. Can we make the ceiling lower in this room? Potatoes don't need height. Dan would answer yes and change the drawing. Sometimes Dan would ask, what humidity is needed for soybeans? Mira would answer, and he would adjust the ventilation. They worked as a system, 2 modules that complemented each other. In the evening, Mira went to the farm, and Dan stayed behind and looked at her drawing. Straight lines, neat labels. She drew just as well as his students, maybe even better. She had an eye for it, a sense of space, an understanding of how the living interacts with the non-living. He thought that Mira was a natural-born agronomist, and that in another world, in another life, she would have earned a degree and worked in a laboratory. But here she was, mealing in a concrete room, whispering to the sprouts. And the sprouts are listening. On the 80th day, Dan went up to the surface for the first time in 3 months with no specific goal. He just went out. Hesso went with him, out of habit. They stood on the roof of the nearest building and looked around. Ruins stretching to the horizon. The sky the color of iodine. Crystalline mushrooms pulsing. Movement somewhere in the distance. A creature or a person. Impossible to tell from here. Hesso said the wasteland knew about them, that it wasn't just the peaceful ones coming for them, that sooner or later someone would come with whom there could be no deal and who could not be defeated in the corridors. Dan asked who she meant. Hesso said Colonel Grant, commander of the Syndicate's northern sector, the one who sent 22 combat code. He lost men, lost weapons, lost face. For a soldier, that's worse than death. He won't forget. He won't forgive. And next time, he won't send 22. He'll send 200. With armored vehicles, with heavy weapons, with a plan. Dan was silent. He stared at the horizon. Then he said that meant they needed the 4th level, and the 5th, and the 6th. Deeper, further, out of reach. Hesso said you can't hide from the army forever. Dan said he wasn't planning to hide forever. He was going to become so big and so useful that destroying him would cost more than putting up with him. Hesso looked at him. She asked how. Dan said that Wontail's caravan was the beginning. Trade, connections, services. The shelter had to become a hub, a point through which goods passed, information, people. Then destroying the hideout would mean destroying the trade route, and everyone needs the trade route, even the syndicate. Hesso listened. Then she nodded slowly. She said it was either genius or suicidal. Dan said that in his line of work, those two words often meant the same thing. Hesso didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. On the 85th day, the second trading group arrived. Not a caravan. 4 scouts from the Khan Tower. Elegant, clean, a different breed. The Khan Tower is the only surviving skyscraper on the site of Seoul, a vertical principality, a clan of engineers, high technology, high prices, arrogance. The senior scout entered the shelter and looked around. He touched the walls, he checked the ventilation. He turned on the faucet and looked at the water. Then he turned to Dan and said he was impressed. For a primitive underground settlement, the level of engineering was unusually high. Dan noted the word primitive and said nothing. The scout said that the Tower Khan was interested in a partnership. They could offer technology, generators, filters, materials. In exchange, they wanted exclusive rights to trade through the shelter. No other partners. Only Tower Khan. Dan said no. The scout wasn't surprised. He smiled. He said that the Khan Tower respects people who say no, because that means you can have real negotiations with them. He left a gift. A small generator. Handheld. Compact. It produces enough energy for 10 lamps. Better than anything Jonas had cobbled together from car parts. A gift. Not an advance. Not a payment. A gesture of goodwill. Or a hook. Dan accepted the generator. He thanked them. He walked the scouts to the exit. Hesso stood nearby and said nothing until they were gone. Then she said that the Khan Tower was more dangerous than the Syndicate. The Syndicate destroys. The Tower buys. And what's bought isn't yours anymore. Dan agreed, but he kept the generator. Because 10 lamps are 10 lives in the dark that will grow brighter. And he had no right to deny his people light out of pride. Day 90. 3 months. 68 residents, 74 rooms, 3 levels. A 4th is in the works. The farm feeds everyone. The clinic is open. The school is open. The engineering school is open. The workshop produces furniture and tools. The hunting party brings meat twice a week. A trade contract with the Wantai. First contact with the Khan Tower. Enemy in the north. Colonel Grant and his 300 fighters. Dan sat in his 3x3 room. The first room, a coffin with a light bulb. He hadn't remodeled it, hadn't expanded it, hadn't decorated it. It remained just as it was on the first day. 3 by 3 meters, smooth walls, one lamp. He came here every evening, sat on the floor, looked at the walls, and sketched. A plan. A big plan. Not the 4th level, not the 5th. The whole city. An underground city for 1,000 people. With streets, with squares, with a park. Yes, an underground park. With trees under lamps. With water. With silence. He sketched it and realized it was madness. That the distance from 68 to 1,000 was like that from a candle to the sun. That Colonel Grant could destroy everything tomorrow. That the crack was widening every day. That he might not have 5 years. He might not even have a single year. But he drew, because an engineer isn't someone who builds what is possible. An engineer is someone who designs what ought to be, and then finds a way to build it. The 4th month began with Dan delegating construction for the first time. Not a trifle, not a shelf or a stool. An entire wing. The east wing of the 3rd level. 6 rooms, a hallway, ventilation, plumbing, sewers, everything. He handed the project over to Oscar and Daria, his students. They had been studying for 3 months, 3 hours every day. Theory, practice, calculations, blueprints. Now the exam. Not on paper, in concrete. Oscar turned pale when Dan placed a blank sheet of paper in front of him and said, "Design." A 15-year-old teenager who, 3 months ago, couldn't even do fractions. Now he had to design a residential wing for 12 people. Daria took it more calmly. She was 30, a former accountant. She was used to responsibility. Numbers didn't scare her. Concrete did. Because numbers can be corrected, but concrete cannot. They worked for a week. Dan didn't interfere. He sat in his room, drawing the 4th level, and listening. Arguments came through the wall. Oscar wanted wide corridors. Daria wanted narrow ones. Oscar wanted high ceilings. Daria thought that was a waste of money. They argued. They fought. They drew. They redrew. They tore up sheets of paper. They started over. Nari sat in the corner and silently wrote everything down. A week later, they brought the design. Dan unfolded the drawing on the table. He looked at it for 5 minutes, then 10. Then he looked up. The design was good. Not perfect. The ventilation duct from the 3rd room ran too close to the water pipe. Condensation would get on the pipe. Corrosion in 6 months. Oscar turned pale. Dan pointed out the problem to him. Oscar looked. Then he closed his eyes. Then he opened them and said what he saw. That the duct needed to be moved 30 centimeters to the left. Dan nodded. The rest was correct. The loads were calculated correctly. The ventilation was sufficient. The corridor wasn't too wide or too narrow. The compromise between Oscar and Daria turned out to be better than either of their individual ideas. Dan signed the drawing. His name. Next to it, 2 others. O. Berg. D. Kozlova. He hung it in the common hallway. Oscar stood in front of the drawing and looked at his signature. Then he turned away quickly. But Dan saw his eyes. Wet. 15 years old. Never went to school. Born after the apocalypse. And there was his signature on the drawing, next to the signature of an engineer from another world. Construction of the East Wing took 4 days. The system poured the concrete. Oscar and Daria supervised every stage. They checked the walls. They checked the joints. They checked the sewer slope. Dan watched from a distance. Hesso came over and stood beside him. She said he was smiling. Dan said he wasn't smiling. Hesso said she could see it. Dan said nothing. He was smiling, because the wing was standing straight, without him. His students had built 6 rooms, and not a single wall had cracked, not a single pipe had leaked. For the first time in 4 months, he thought that maybe the shelter would outlive him. On the 100th day, the population had surpassed 80. The shelter was growing. Rumors of an underground city spread across the wasteland like ripples from a stone. People came. Solos, couples, families, groups. Every week, new faces at the entrance. Every week, Dan went out, looked them in the eye, said welcome. The system credited coins. He built. Mira expanded the farm to 12 beds in 4 rooms. The potatoes were growing. Real potatoes. Round, starchy, filling. The first day Mira put boiled potatoes on the table in the common room, everyone fell silent. Then they ate in silence, with their eyes closed, like a prayer. The old caravan driver, the one sitting on Gina's stool with the armrest, he chewed the potatoes and tears streamed down his face. He said the last time he'd eaten a thing in 1985. His mother had cooked them, with butter and dill. They had no butter or dill, but they had potatoes. Real ones. Hot. Their own. Tom Evans didn't become an engineer. He became something more important. Tom became a logistics specialist. He organized the shelter's supply system, routes on the surface, resource collection points, raid schedules. Every sortie was planned, every kilogram accounted for, every route marked on the map. Tom didn't invent. He systematized. He took chaos and turned it to order. Dan looked at his spreadsheets and thought that in the world before the rift, Tom would have made an excellent project manager. Here, he had become the man without whom the shelter would have suffocated under its own growth. On the 110th day, Dan descended to the 4th level for the first time. The system had carved a staircase into the rock. Yes. At a depth of 25 meters, the soil gave way to rock. Rock. Granite. Heavy. Eternal. Dan stood at the bottom of the new level and touched the walls. Not concrete. Stone. Real stone. He tapped it with his knuckles. The sound was dull, solid, perfect. The 4th level is a refuge within a refuge, the last line of defense. Neither an army, nor a storm, nor the rift can reach this place. 25 meters of rock overhead. Dan built it differently, without rushing, checking every room, every turn. This would be the command center. This would be the seed vault. This would be the archive. All the blueprints, all the records, all the notebooks, all the knowledge he had accumulated and that would be accumulated after him. Paper isn't eternal, but stone is eternal. Dan carved diagrams directly into the walls, a map of the shelter, a ventilation calculation table, strength formulas, the basic laws of physics. If everything collapses, if the paper burns, if people forget, the walls of the 4th level will tell those who come after them how to rebuild. Hesso went down to him in the evening. She stood and looked at the walls covered with formulas and diagrams. Then she said it looked like a temple. Dan said it was a library. Hesso said that in this world, there's no difference between a library and a temple. Day 115. Dan stood at the entrance to the shelter and looked north. Hesso was beside him. Rick was beside him. Dust on the horizon, lots of dust. More than last time, much more. Hesso raised her binoculars. One of the syndicate's trophies. She looked. Then she lowered them. Her face was impassive. Her voice was steady. She said, "A column. Heavy equipment. 3 armored vehicles. At least 100 infantrymen. The banner of the Granite Syndicate." Colonel Grant decided he wouldn't send out detachments anymore. He's going himself. Dan closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Then he opened them. Told everyone to get down. Get ready. They had 12 hours. Hesso calculated based on the convoy's speed. Heavy equipment moves slowly through the ruins. 20 hours. Dan called a meeting. Hesso, Rick, Lena, Jin, Jonas, Mira, Oscar, Daria. 9 people in his office on the 4th level. He spread out the map. He showed the convoy's route. Numbers, weapons, armored vehicles. 100 fighters against 80 residents, 20 of whom are combat ready. 12 assault rifles, 8 pistols, spears, knives. Against 3 armored vehicles and 100 assault rifles. The math was simple and brutal. Lena said we needed to evacuate. Get everyone to the 4th level. Block access. Wait. Hesso said we couldn't wait. The syndicate wouldn't leave. They'll dig, blow things up, pump in smoke. Sooner or later, they'll break through. Rick said we could set up an ambush at the approaches, use the city's terrain. Dan listened. Then he raised his hand. Everyone fell silent. He said there would be no evacuation and no ambush. He said the corridors work. They proved it the first time. 22 fighters neutralized without casualties. But now the enemy knows about the corridors. The 18 who were released told them. So we need to change tactics. Dan stood up and led them through the shelter. 1st level. He had completely rebuilt it after the first assault. New corridors, new traps. But against 100 men, that wasn't enough. So he had prepared something else. He stopped in front of a wall at the end of the 1st level corridor. He pressed a stone. The wall shifted. Behind it was a passage, narrow, dark, leading upward, to the surface. A 2nd exit. No. A 3rd. A 4th. A 5th. Over the past 3 weeks, Dan had been quietly building emergency exits. 5 of them, in different directions, between 200 and 500 meters from the main entrance. Each one camouflaged. Each one leading out inside the ruined building. Hesso watched and said nothing. Then she asked why. Dan explained. The syndicate would come to the main entrance. They'll climb down. They'll end up in the corridors. Some will get stuck. Some will get lost. But there are 100 of them. Even if half get stuck, 50 will push deeper. And then Phase 2 begins. While they're inside. While their vehicles are up top without infantry cover. Hesso, Rick, and 10 fighters will exit through the emergency exits. They'll get behind them. Vehicles without crews are defenseless. 3 armored vehicles. Disable them, take them away, destroy them. Without their vehicles, the syndicate is just people in concrete corridors. And in concrete corridors, Dan is a god. Hesso listened. Rick listened. Then Hesso said it might work. Rick said the syndicate's armored vehicles run on diesel. If you pull out the fuel line, the vehicle is dead. 5 seconds of work. If you can get close without being noticed. Dan said this was Hesso's job. She's the best fighter within a 20-kilometer radius. Hesso looked at him. Then she nodded. No smile, no bravado. The nod of a professional who had accepted the task. 12 hours turned into 10, then into 8. Dan worked non-stop. The coins he'd saved over the last 2 weeks went toward fortifying the corridors. New doors, new dead ends, new ventilation valves. The system built, and he directed. Every wall in the right place, every turn at the right angle. Mira moved the seeds to the 4th level, to a storage room in the rock. If everything above perishes, the seeds will survive. Lena prepared the infirmary. She laid out the instruments. She laid out the bandages. She heated water. She didn't know how many wounded there would be, but she knew there would be some. Jin built barricades out of rebar and concrete blocks at key points. Tom organized the evacuation of the non-combatants to the 4th level. Women, children, the elderly, the wounded. Everyone downstairs, in the rock, behind concrete doors. Sua didn't want to leave. She stood in the hallway and said she wanted to help. Jin looked at his daughter. 10 years old. She had grown over these 4 months. Not physically, in spirit. But she was 10, and Jin said no, firmly. For the first time in 4 months, Sua cried. Nari took her by the hand and led her downstairs. Silently, as always. But Sua went, because Nari was holding her tight. At dawn, Hesso reported. The column was 5 kilometers away. They'd stopped for the night. They'd move out again at dawn. They'd be here in 2 hours. Dan stood at the entrance to the shelter. He looked up at the iodine-colored sky one last time. Then he went downstairs. He closed the hatch. And he waited. They arrived 2 hours and 20 minutes later. Hesso counted through the periscope that Jonas had assembled from mirrors and a pipe. 96 infantrymen. 3 armored vehicles. 1 command vehicle. A man was walking in front. Tall, gray-haired, straight back. A uniform jacket with insignia. Colonel Marcus Grant. He had come in person. They surrounded the entrance. Grant stepped forward. He shouted into the hatch. He called Dan by name. He said he was giving them 5 minutes to surrender voluntarily, that if the residents came out on their own, no one would be harmed, that the shelter would be confiscated and placed under the control of the syndicate, that resistance was futile. 5 minutes of silence. Dan sat on the 2nd level and listened through the ventilation shaft. Grant's voice came through hollowly, distorted, but the words were clear. 5 minutes passed. Grant gave the order. The first wave went down. 20 fighters, well-equipped, with flashlights, with weapons. They descended through the main hatch, entered the 1st level. Empty, just like last time. But this time they knew. They were ready. They moved cautiously, checking the corners, checking the doors, moving slowly toward the staircase to the 2nd level. They found the staircase. They went down. The 2nd level greeted them with new corridors. Not the ones the released ones had seen. Different ones. Rearranged. The first group of 5 turned into a false passage. The door closed. The 5 were trapped. The second group saw what had happened. They started shooting at the door. Ricochets. In the narrow concrete corridor, a bullet bounces off the walls like a billiard ball. 2 wounded each other with their own ricochets. Panic. Retreat. Grant sent a second wave. 30 men. With commanders. With discipline. These moved more carefully. They didn't shoot. They didn't split up. They stayed together as a group. But the corridors were narrowing. The group of 30 stretched out into a line. The turns broke their formation. Communication was lost. And then Dan blocked the ventilation in the central section. Not completely. Partially. The air became heavy, stifling. Not deadly, but enough to make people breathe harder, think slower, panic faster. While 50 syndicate fighters wandered inside the bunker, Hesso operated outside. She led 10 people through an emergency exit 300 meters to the east. Inside, a ruined warehouse. Quietly, quickly, Along the route Dan had sketched in his notebook a week earlier, through the ruins, through the shadows, to the armored vehicles. 46 syndicate fighters remained upstairs, guarding the perimeter. But the perimeter was large. 3 armored vehicles were stationed at different points. There was distance between them. Hesso split the group. 3 trios, 1 per vehicle, plus herself. Rick went to the nearest vehicle. 5 seconds. The fuel line was ripped out. Diesel flooded the ground. The vehicle was dead. The second trio. Same operation. 5 seconds. The third vehicle. The driver noticed. He shouted. Hesso threw a knife 12 meters, right in the hand. The driver dropped his weapon. The trio ran up. The hose was pulled out. 3 armored vehicles dead in 40 seconds. Grant heard screams upstairs. He realized what was happening. He called people out of the shelter, but the people inside couldn't get out quickly. The corridors blocked their way. Those who had gone deep inside were lost. Those closer to the exit were crammed into narrow passages. A stampede. Chaos. Grant stood by the hatch and watched as his army fell apart. Not from fire, not from bombs, from concrete walls and right angles. 3 hours later, it was all over. 27 syndicate fighters were trapped in dead-end corridors of the shelter. 18 were wounded. By their own ricochets and the crush in the narrow corridors, not a single shelter resident was hurt. Hesso got a cut on her shoulder. Rick bruised his knee. That was it. Grant stood on the surface, without equipment, without half his men, without a plan. The remaining fighters looked at him and waited for orders. Dan went upstairs. He went out through the main hatch, alone, unarmed. Hesso hissed at his back that he was crazy. Dan walked up to Grant, 2 meters between them. Grant looked at him, gray-haired, tired. An old soldier who had just lost a battle to concrete walls. Dan said he wanted to talk. Grant said there was nothing to talk about. Dan said there was. He said he understood Grant, that the syndicate was created to protect people, that in the early years after the rift, military bases were the only refuge, that protection contracts made sense when no one else could protect them. But the world has changed. The shelter exists, and it's not a competitor to the syndicate. It's a partner. Grant was silent. Dan continued. He said that the syndicate controls the surface. The shelter controls the underground. The surface without the underground is doomed. The rift is expanding. In 5 years, it will be impossible to live above ground. The syndicate needs the underground, and the underground needs resources that are only found on the surface. Cooperation or the death of both. Grant listened. Then he said that Dan was naive, that the world doesn't run on trust, that trust kills. Dan said he wasn't offering trust. He was offering a contract, an honest one, a transparent one, with terms that benefit both sides. Grant looked at him for a long time. Then he said he'd think about it, and he left. He took the remaining fighters with him. He took the wounded. Dan released the prisoners an hour later, unarmed, just like last time. The weapons stayed in the hideout. This time, 7 remained. 7 syndicate fighters. They'd seen the hideout, seen how it worked, seen that this wasn't a prison or a barracks. This was a home. And they decided to stay. 70 coins, 6 months, 180 days, 123 residents, 97 rooms on 4 levels. Dan reread his notes and couldn't believe it. 6 months ago, he'd woken up in a concrete box with no water and no air. Now, beneath his feet, lay 4 floors of a living underground city, with a farm that feeds everyone, with a clinic where Lena performs surgeries by lamplight, with a school where children learn to read from his blueprints, with a workshop where Jin makes furniture and Jonas assembles generators. With a library where 3 textbooks sit on the shelves and a stack of notebooks with notes that will one day become textbooks themselves. Ravan Won-ta'il came for the second time. He brought more than the first time. Seeds, medicine, cloth, metal, and news. Han Tower is sending an envoy, not scouts, the clan's heiress, in person, for negotiations. Dan listened and said nothing. Hesso listened and said that this was either a sign of respect or a reconnaissance in force. The envoy arrived a week later. She entered the shelter, and Dan's world shifted slightly off its axis. Ji-woo Lim, 29 years old, tall, straight back, clean clothes, neat haircut. She looked like a person from another century, not from this wasteland, not from this world. She came with 2 bodyguards, left them at the entrance, entered alone, walked through the corridors of the first level, stopped, touched the wall, then looked at the ceiling, at the ventilation grill, at the slope of the floor, at the joint between the wall and the ceiling. Dan watched. She wasn't just looking, she was analyzing. An engineer. A real engineer. She turned to him and said that the joint between modules 3 and 4 on the first level had a tolerance of 1.5 centimeters. That's a bit much. In the tower, the tolerance is 2 millimeters. Dan replied that the tower had been standing before the rift and was built using industrial equipment. His shelter was built by the system in the ground without a single crane. 1.5 centimeters is a feat, not a flaw. Ji-woo looked at him. Then she almost smiled. She said he was right. They talked for 4 hours. Not about politics, not about trade, not about alliances. About engineering, about loads, about the distribution of soil pressure on the side walls, about the filtration coefficient for sandy soils, about methods for calculating ventilation systems for enclosed spaces. Hesso stood in the doorway, listened for 10 minutes, and left. She said it was scarier than any battle. Lena peeked in an hour later and saw 2 sheets of paper covered with formulas and diagrams. Dan and Ji-woo were sitting across from each other, arguing about the strength of arch structures. Lena shook her head and left. 4 hours later, Ji-woo fell silent. She looked at Dan, then at the drawings on the walls. Then she said he was the best engineer she'd ever met, including her father, who built the Han Tower. Dan said he wasn't building a tower. He was building a burrow in the ground. Ji-woo said that a burrow that breathes and grows and feeds 123 people is more complicated than a skyscraper. A skyscraper stands still. A burrow lives. Negotiations. The Khan Tower offered technology, generators, water purifiers, building materials, electronics. In return, the tower wanted a share, not 30% like the syndicate. 10% of the population growth. Every 10th new resident of the shelter receives Khan Tower citizenship. They can live in the tower, or they can stay in the shelter as a citizen of the tower. Dual loyalty. Dan understood immediately. This isn't trade. It's colonization. Soft, elegant, but colonization. He said no. Ji-woo wasn't surprised. She asked what he wanted. Dan said he wanted trade. Fair trade. Goods for goods. Services for services. No shares, no loyalty, no strings attached. Ji-woo said that the tower doesn't trade on equal terms with settlements of fewer than 1,000 people. Protocol. Dan said that in a year he'd have 1,000. Ji-woo looked at him. He wasn't joking. She could see that. They negotiated for 3 days. Ji-woo stayed in the guest rooms. She ate at the communal table. She walked around the shelter. She talked to the residents. With Mira about the farm, with Eunice about the generators, with Oscar about load calculations, with Nari who showed her notes. Ji-woo leafed through them and said nothing. Then she said the girl was more talented than half the tower's engineers. On the third day, Ji-woo went to Dan and said she was staying, not as an envoy of the tower, as a resident. Dan didn't understand. He asked why. Ji-woo said that her whole life she had been prepared to rule the tower, the heiress, the clan's princess. She knew the theory, the formulas, the calculations, but she had never once in her life built anything with her own hands. In the tower, everything was built before her. All she had to do was manage what was already there. Here, they build, every day. New walls, new rooms, new systems. She wants to build, for the first time in her life, with her own hands. Dan looked at her. Then he said she needed to talk to the tower. Ji-woo said she already had. She sent a message with her bodyguards. Her father would be furious. But her father was far away, and the concrete was close. The system beeped. Resident added, Ji-woo Lim, 29 years old, 10 coins. Dan gave her the third level, entirely. Designing a new wing, 12 rooms, hallways, ventilation, plumbing, without his control, without his veto power, without his anything. Her level, her project. Ji-woo took a blank sheet of paper, a pencil. She looked at Dan. He nodded. She began to sketch. She hadn't slept for 3 days, not out of fear, out of happiness. Lena peeked in on her and shook her head. Another obsessive. Hesso peeked in and frowned. A new person, from the tower, can't be trusted right away. Mira silently brought her a hot drink and set it on the table. Ji-woo looked up. She looked at Mira. She said thank you. Mira nodded and left. Ji-woo returned to the drawing. 3 days later, she presented the project. Dan looked at it for an hour, in silence. The design was different, not how he built. Ji-woo designed differently, more elegant, more economical. She used arched structures where Dan had placed straight slabs. An arch distributes the load more evenly. Less material, greater strength. Ventilation ducts were integrated into the walls rather than laid separately. Fewer pipes, fewer joints, fewer leaks. Dan looked up. He looked at Ji-woo. He said the design was better than what he would have done himself. Ji-woo said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she took the drawing off the table. For the first time in her life, someone had told her she'd done better. Not as bad as her father. Not good enough for an heiress. Better. Construction of the new wing took a week. Ji-woo oversaw every stage. She stood in the hallways and watched as the system poured the concrete. She checked every joint, every corner, every millimeter. A tolerance of 4 millimeters. Not 2, like in the tower, but twice as good as Dan's 1.5 centimeters. She had learned to work with the system. The system obeyed Dan. But Dan guided it according to Ji-woo's blueprints. 2 engineers, 1 tool, 1 result. On the 191st day, the wing was ready. 12 rooms, arched ceilings, built-in ventilation, a 20% space savings compared to previous levels. Residents walked in and stopped. The ceilings were different, smooth, rounded, beautiful. Not just functional, beautiful. Ji-woo stood in the hallway of her wing and looked at the walls. Dung stood beside her. He was silent. Then he said it was the best thing built in the shelter. Ji-woo said it was the first thing she had ever built in her life. They stood side by side in silence, in the warm light of a fake sunset. Children's laughter beyond the wall, the sound of running water, the clatter of tools from the workshop, the sounds of home. A year, 365 days, 252 residents, 180 rooms across 5 levels. Dan stood in the common room on the 2nd level and watched the people. Evening, dinner, the communal table, long, made by Jin from planks and rebar. Seated at the table were people he knew by name, every single one. 252 names. He remembered when each one arrived, in what condition, what they said first, where they live now. Next to the communal table was a children's table. 15 children. Sua at the head. She is 11. She commanded the children's table with the authority of a general. She handed out portions. She made sure the little ones ate. She settled disputes. Nari sat next to her, silent, focused, with a notebook. She was writing something down even while eating. Lena sat by the wall with a baby in her arms. The baby was 10 months old. He was clapping his hands and babbling something. His mother sat next to him and ate hot potato and bean soup. Hearty, thick, real food. Heso wasn't sitting. She was standing by the door. A habit. She always stood by the door, facing the hallway, with her back to the wall. An automatic rifle slung over her shoulder. She had relaxed over the past few months. Just a little. But her shoulders were lower and her eyes softer. Rick sat across from her, cleaning his pistol. They didn't speak. No need. 2 warriors who understood each other without words. Mira brought a dish to the table. Hot. A smell that made everyone turn their heads. Bread. Real bread, made from wheat flour. Mira had grown the wheat in 4 months. Sarah Berg had found a way to grind the grain between 2 stones. Lena had kneaded the dough. Jonas had built an oven out of bricks found on the surface and a metal box. The loaf turned out lopsided, burnt on the bottom, pale on top, hard as a rock. Perfect. Dan took a piece, took a bite, closed his eyes. Bread. He hadn't eaten bread since he died in the tunnel in his past life. A whole year. Hot bread. In an underground city. 5 levels of concrete and rock below. Behind the wall, someone began to cry. An old caravan driver. He was crying over the bread. Sua brought him a larger piece. He took it with both hands and held it to his face. He inhaled the scent. Then he ate, slowly, with his eyes closed. Dan watched this and thought about what he had built. Not walls, not rooms, not ventilation and water systems. He had built a place where people cry over bread, where children laugh at dinner, where an old man sits on a stool made just for his height and eats hot bread for the first time in 40 years. This isn't a shelter. It's a home. After dinner, Dan went down to the 4th level, to the archives. The walls were covered with formulas and diagrams, shelves lined with notebooks and sheets of paper. A year's worth of documentation, every day, every decision, every blueprint. He hadn't come here for the documents. He came for an answer. 3 months ago, Jiwoo went down to the 4th level to survey the rock mass for the 5th level. She found a passage, not built by the system, natural. A crack in the rock. Behind the crack, a tunnel. Old. Man-made. Concrete walls, ceiling beams, cable trays. Someone built this decades ago. Dan walked 300 meters down the tunnel. He found a plaque on the wall. Metal. Rusty. But the letters were legible. Underground Shelter Project Number 7. Completion date for Phase 1, 1981. Contractor. Next came the company name, and the signature of the engineer in charge. Dan stared at the signature. It was his. His signature. His handwriting. Daniel Song. 1981. 20 years before he was born. He stood in the tunnel and stared at the plaque for 5 minutes, then 10. Then he sat down on the floor and leaned against the wall. Someone knew. Someone knew he would come. Someone built this tunnel knowing that one day Dan Song would wake up in a 3x3 concrete box and he would need a foundation on which to build. The system. The voice in his head. The coins. The rooms. None of it was random. Not a gift. Not a mistake. It was a project. Planned. Calculated. Engineered. By someone who knew his work, his style, his way of thinking. By him. Another him, from another time. Dan sat on the floor of the old tunnel and, for the first time in a year, didn't know what to do. He went back upstairs, didn't tell anyone, not yet. For 3 months he explored the tunnel alone, 2 hours every night. The tunnel went deep. Branches, rooms, some had collapsed, some intact. In one of the intact ones he found a table, papers on the table, yellowed, fragile. Blueprints. His blueprints. His lines. His markings. A project for an underground city, the scale of which Dan could not comprehend. 10,000 people. 20 levels. Farms, factories, schools, hospitals. Everything. The blueprints were dated from different years. 1981, 1995, 2003, 2011, 2019. 40 years of work by one man who signed his name as Daniel Song. Today he had returned here again. He sat down at the same table, spread out the blueprints, and found an envelope. He hadn't noticed it before, under a stack of papers. The envelope was sealed. There was writing on it. To young Dan. His handwriting. Senile. Shaky. But his. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A note. A short one. Dan, if you're reading this, it means you're here. It means the system has reached you. It means someone heard. I've lived 86 years, 40 of them after the rift. I built alone, every day, every year. 7 shelters, not a single one survived. People died, they left, betrayed. I made mistakes, too many mistakes. In the end, I realized I'd started too late. What if I'd started sooner? If I'd been younger? If I'd had people with me from day one? Everything would have been different. I died with that thought. And someone heard. I don't know who, I don't know how, but the system has reached you. My blueprints are at your feet. My mistakes are in my notes. Learn from them. Don't repeat them. Do better than I did. You have what I didn't have. Time, people, and a 3x3 room where it all begins. I'm proud of you. Even if we never meet. Even if you're just another me from another time. I'm proud. Build. Daniel Song, 2021. Dan sat holding the letter. His hands were shaking. He read it 3 times, then a fourth. Then he put it on the table. He stood up, walked around the room, sat back down. He read it a fifth time. Old Dan, another Dan, from a parallel timeline. He lived 86 years. He built for 40 years on his own. He died thinking he had started too late, and someone heard that thought and sent the system through time to young Dan, who died in a tunnel wind slab and woke up in a concrete box with a voice in his head, with 0 coins, with a whole world to build. Dan folded the letter, put it in his pocket. He walked out of the old tunnel. He went upstairs. He walked through the shelter's corridors, past the farm where Mira was watering the garden beds, past the workshop where Jean was planing a board, past the school where it was dark and quiet because it was night, past the infirmary where Lena was dozing in a chair next to a patient, past the common room where a fake sunset was fading with its last pink glimmers, past Hezo's room where the light was on and a quiet tapping could be heard. She was cleaning her weapon. She always cleans it before bed. He reached his room, 3 by 3, first floor. He sat down on the floor, leaned against the wall, took out the letter, read it again. Do better than I did. He put the letter away, took out a blank sheet of paper, a pencil, and began to sketch. A city of 10,000, based on the blueprints of his former self, corrected, supplemented, improved. His version, his city, for those who are yet to come. 2.5 years, 912 days, 2,483 residents, 5 levels, 473 rooms, an underground city. Dan stood in the central square of the 3rd level. Yes, a square, an underground square. A room 20 by 20 meters with a 6-meter ceiling, a vaulted arch, Juwoo's design, fake windows all around the perimeter, warm light, eternal sunset, a fountain in the middle of the square, a real one. Water from an underground spring rises through pipes and falls back down. Jonas assembled a pump from car parts. The fountain runs 20 hours a day, 4 hours for maintenance. Benches surround the square. Jin's work. In 2 years, he hasn't made a single identical bench. Each one for a specific spot, a specific corner, a specific person who loves to sit right here. An old caravan driver. He's still alive, sitting on his little stool with an armrest. The one Jean made for him in the 4th month. The stool has survived 2 repairs and 1 leg replacement. The old man calls it a throne. There are always children around him. He tells stories about the world before the crack. The children listen. Some of these stories aren't true anymore. Time erodes memory. But the children don't know that, and the old man doesn't know, and that's okay. Stories don't have to be accurate. They have to give hope. Dan was walking down the street. Yes, the street. A 3-meter wide corridor, doors on both sides. Behind every door, a family, or a single person, or a couple. 200 apartments, each with a fake window, each with water, each with ventilation. There are drawings on the walls of the corridor. The children drew them. Nari started it. She drew in silence, just as she did everything. Ventilation diagrams. Then the other children picked it up and drew other things. Flowers, trees, the sky. A blue sky none of them had ever seen. They drew it based on the old man's descriptions. Blue, with white clouds, with a yellow sun. Not iodine-colored, not brown. Blue. Dan stopped at every drawing, every day, because every day a new one appeared. Mira's farm took up an entire floor, 24 rooms. Wheat, rice, potatoes, soybeans, tomatoes, carrots, onions, cabbage, herbs, and one room that wasn't a farm, a greenhouse, her own. Mira grew flowers in it. Dan had built it a year ago, not as a shelter, for Mira. Because in a world where everything is functional, Mira deserved something useless and beautiful. Flowers don't feed you. They don't heal. They don't protect. They're just beautiful. Mira went into the greenhouse every evening. She watered the flowers. She talked to them, quietly, as always. When Dan built the greenhouse and said it was for her, not for a shelter, for her personally, Mira stood in the doorway and didn't move for 2 minutes. Then she turned and went to her room. Tom said later that she cried all night. Not from grief, from something else. Lena's clinic had become a hospital, an entire wing, 8 wards, 2 isolation rooms, an operating room, a delivery room. Yes, a delivery room. 11 children were born in the shelter over 2 years. The first child was born 9 months after it was founded. The mother was one of the former caravan women. Lena delivered the baby by lamplight. Her hands were shaking, because the last time she'd done this was before the rift, 20 years ago. The baby was born healthy, a boy. He cried so loud you could hear him 2 levels up. Lena held him and couldn't bring herself to give him to the mother. For 2 minutes, she just held him. Then she handed him over. She smiled. She went into her office. She locked the door. Dan didn't come in. He knew. She had lost her daughter 2 years before they met. Every child born in the shelter was both a joy and a pain to her. But she accepted every one. Every time her hands trembled. Every time she smiled. Every time she walked away and locked the door. Dan could have told her, could have offered to talk, but he wasn't good with words. He was good with concrete. So he built a nursery, a separate room on the 2nd level, with a fake window, with a warm floor. Jonas ran the heating through the hot water pipes, with toys that Jean carved out of wood, with drawings on the walls. Lena saw the playroom and sat down on the floor right in the hallway. She sat there for 5 minutes. Then she stood up and went to work. She didn't say a word, but Dan saw. She understood. Dan's school had grown to 3 grades: elementary, middle, engineering. The elementary school was run by Hana-san. She arrived at the shelter in her 8th month, 34 years old, a former math teacher. 7 years alone in the school basement. 7 years without a single person to talk to. She talked to the walls. She had almost lost her voice, literally. When Dan found her, she spoke in a whisper, a hoarse, cracked whisper. He brought her to the shelter, showed her the classroom. 30 seats, a blackboard, chalk, textbooks. Asked her to teach the first lesson. Hana opened her mouth and couldn't speak. She stood in front of the class. 30 children were looking at her. Silence. A minute. Hana swallowed, opened her mouth again. The sound came out weak, shaky. She said, "Good morning." 2 words. The first in 7 years spoken to living people rather than to walls. The children replied, "Good morning," in unison, loudly, like children. Hana stood and listened to the echo of their voices. Then she began the lesson. Her voice grew stronger after a week. After a month, she spoke normally. After 3 months, she spoke loudly, confidently, strictly, like a teacher. Because she was a teacher. Always. Even when she talked to the walls. Now she has 30 students in her first-grade class. She teaches them to read, to write, to count, to think. She talks to Dan in the evenings. She comes into his 3x3 room, sits down on the floor next to him, says, "Enough, go to sleep." He says, "5 more minutes." She says, "No, now." And he lies down. Because Hannah is the only person in the shelter whom he obeys unconditionally. Not because she's stronger or smarter, because she looks at him and doesn't see an architect, not a leader, not a builder. She sees a tired 29-year-old guy who needs someone to tell him enough is enough. An engineer school, 5th graduating class, 12 students in 2 years. Oscar is the best of them. He designs on his own, without supervision, without review. Dan signs his blueprints without looking because he knows Oscar won't make a mistake. If he does make a mistake, he'll find it and fix it himself. Nari. She's 14. She still doesn't speak, but she draws. Her drawings hang next to Dan's, Jiwoo's, and Oscar's on the walls of the 4th level archive. She signs them with a single letter, N. Dan knows that in 5 years she'll be the best engineer in the shelter. Better than Oscar. Better than Jiwoo. Maybe even better than him. She sees space as music, not in volumes and angles, in rhythms and pauses. Her corridors breathe, her rooms sing. It's impossible to describe in words, but when you enter a space designed by Nari, you feel that it's right. Not functionally right, humanly right. The Granite Syndicate. Colonel Grant thought about it for a year. Then he sent a messenger, not a soldier, a messenger, with a letter, a contract, on Dan's terms. Trade. Surface resources in exchange for underground space for the Syndicate's garrisons. Not control, a lease. Dan read the contract for 3 days. Jiwoo checked the wording. Hesso checked the military clauses. Lena checked the medical clauses. They signed it. The Granite Syndicate became the shelter's 3rd trading partner, after Wantel's Caravan and the Han Tower. 3 powers of the wasteland, bound by a single underground city, which, a year ago, had been a 3x3 concrete box. Dan sat in his room, the first one. He hadn't remodeled it, not once in 2.5 years. 3x3, a single lamp, smooth walls, a coffin with a light bulb. He came here every evening, sat on the floor, sketched, thought, remembered. Tonight he wasn't sketching. He sat and listened. Sounds came through the walls, lots of sounds. Laughter, voices, knocking, music. One of the residents had found a guitar on the surface, with 1 string. Jonas had strung the rest with wire. The sound wasn't right, but there was music. Every evening, someone played and someone sang. Out of tune, off key, perfect. Dan listened. Footsteps outside the door. Lena. She came in, saw him on the floor, said he hadn't gone out to the people again. Dan raised his head, said he didn't know how to be with them. He only knew how to build for them. Lena sat down next to him, peered into the notebook on his lap. A new drawing. Level 6. Signed in neat handwriting in the margins. For those who are yet to come. Lena looked at the inscription. Then she rested her head on his shoulder. Dan froze. For a second. 2. Then he relaxed. Laughter behind the wall. Music. The voices of 2,500 people who live underground, who cry over bread and laugh at a fake sunset, who teach children to read engineering blueprints and grow flowers in concrete rooms, who came here because an engineer from Seattle woke up in a concrete box and didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't give up. Instead, he took out a notebook and began to design. Mira brought hot broth. She set it by the door, silently, as always. Hesso walked past in the hallway. She peeked in. She saw Lena and Dan. She smiled slightly. The first real smile in 2 years. She walked on. Ji Woo sat in her workshop 1 floor below, drafting the 7th level. Arched vaults, built-in ventilation, a 3mm tolerance. Better than in the tower. Oscar and Daria were designing the east wing of the 6th level. Without Dan. Without Ji Woo. On their own. Nari sat in the 4th level archive, surrounded by walls covered in formulas, surrounded by old Dan's blueprints from a parallel time. She studied them, compared them to her own, found mistakes, corrected them, in silence, as always. Hana put the children to bed. She returned to her room. She opened her math textbook. Yellowed pages, a worn-out cover. She read it every evening, preparing for tomorrow's lesson, as if tomorrow's lesson were the most important one. For her, every lesson is the most important one, because 7 years without a voice taught her one thing. Every word matters. The old caravan driver sat on his throne in the square. The children had dispersed. The square was empty. The fountain trickled. The fake sunset was fading. The old man sat and watched the water. He was smiling. He had come to die in the warmth. He stayed to live. 11 months ago, Dan asked him his name. In all that time, they had never discussed his name. Everyone just called him the old man. He said his name was Edward Noyes. Dan wrote it down in his journal. Edward Noyes, resident number 31. Status, active. Occupation, keeper of stories. It wasn't a job title. It was a recognition. Dan sat on the floor of his room, Lena beside him, her head on his shoulder. Beyond the wall lay the city. His city. Not his, theirs. But he had built it, room by room, wall by wall, person by person. From a 3x3 concrete box, from 0 coins, from a notebook and a pencil, from stubbornness and formulas and the belief that proper ventilation is more important than a beautiful facade. Dan took a letter from his old self out of his pocket. He reread the last line. Do better than I did. Then he turned the page over and wrote on the back, I am. He put the letter back, closed the notebook, closed his eyes. Lena was breathing evenly. She had fallen asleep. Behind the wall, a fountain was murmuring. A guitar was playing softly. Someone was singing a lullaby. Dan's song, 29 years old, an engineer from Seattle. A man who died in his own tunnel and woke up in a strange world. Who didn't scream, who took out a notebook, who wrote, Sandy soil needs waterproofing, and began to build. He sat on the floor of a 3x3 concrete room, the first room, which he never rebuilt, because this was the beginning, and you don't touch the beginning. 2,500 people lived beyond the walls of this room. They slept, they breathed clean air, they drank clean water. Their children went to school, their elders told stories. Their engineers were sketching out the future. Their soldiers stood guard. Their farmers grew bread. Their doctors treated the sick. Their teachers gave a voice to those who had lost theirs. The city, his city, underground, under a sky the color of iodine, under the crack that widens every day, a city that stands and will stand, because the walls were designed by someone who knows how things break, and built so they wouldn't break. Beyond the wall, silence. The city sleeps. Dan sleeps. Tomorrow will be a new day. New walls, new people, new blueprints. A new room for someone who hasn't arrived yet, but will surely come. Because his name is already signed on the blueprint. For those who are yet to come. The end.